I'll start again. Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the late start. We were just getting a few internal things organised amongst ourselves, so we're sorry to keep you waiting. Just before we start today, there's two things I just want to say. The first one is that unlike the hearing up until now, where it's largely been lawyers and professionals that deal in this space all the time, for those of you that are presenting today that aren't experienced in that role and are just coming along to express your personal views about things, please try and be as relaxed as you can. This process has the potential to be a little bit intimidating for people that aren't familiar with it. You may have seen some of the questions that we've asked of the professionals. I mean, they're expecting and expected to be able to answer difficult questions when they're posed to them. That's not the case with submitters. Generally, we're simply going to ask questions if we can't quite follow what it is you've said, or we'd like you to elaborate on something so we fully understand it and appreciate your point of view. So as far as those individual submitters are concerned, we're simply here to listen to what you've got to say, ask you any questions where we don't follow, and then you're free to just listen to the rest of the hearing. So please try and be as relaxed about that as you can. We're not going to get angry or growl at anybody or ask them pointed questions and all those sorts of things. The second thing is a question for Mr. Berry. Mr. Berry, it's pretty certain that we're going to finish with the submitters and the council sometime during, if not the morning, the early afternoon. You have a right of reply. Given that the council will immediately precede that, do you have any suggestions for us as to timing and how you would like your reply to be presented?
Yes, sir. I think my request to you is that we do it as we often do, and that is to reply briefly orally to hit the high points from the hearing and the key issues that have arisen while we are still in a conversation, but then to file a more detailed written reply later in which we can deal with evidential matters and matters in detail in a way that we can't do today. And we were hoping that I'd probably take half an hour to reply today and then look to file some written submissions and reply by the end of next week.
In terms of the verbal reply, would you be proposing to do that immediately that the council finished its presentation of its section 42A report, or do you need some time to assemble your thoughts and so forth?
We know what their position is, and I won't be responding in detail to that. It's more the sort of thrust of the hearing commenting on. So I won't need any time.
Okay, no, that's helpful.
I think sorry,
Mr. Kearney, you go.
There's another option, and it's probably because we may have questions for you, and your oral may not go far enough, and then we just get written submissions. I wonder whether one of the other options is to give you some time to prepare some written response which you can speak to, and then you can expand on that. By doing that, we'd be given the opportunity to ask the questions because you'll cover the field, and then you can expand in your further later on. I'm not sure. What do you think about that?
So you're suggesting, sir, that we don't reply at all today, we file a written reply and then reconvene for the purpose of presenting that?
Well, I think we'd give you till tomorrow morning to reply in writing, subject to more detailed submissions later on. I'm not sure what other council council think of that, or whether that's reasonable or what.
Well, I don't think, sir, that I'm going to be able to corral all of the inputs from our witnesses overnight.
Yeah.
And so I would prefer to reply briefly, orally, and then to file a written reply next week. And if you then had questions, we could reconvene, or we could deal with those on the papers.
All right. Over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Well, I was going to ask the same question and wonder whether there was a halfway house, which may not go as far as what Mr. Cooney has said, but to allow, I mean, there's not a lot of value in having a sort of a quick fire session that's sort of half the story, as it were. But if you had overnight, even if you weren't able to reduce those to writing and they weren't complete, your oral reply might be a bit more fulsome if it were done tomorrow than what, so that we were able to question more in depth perhaps than we would be if you were to go straight after lunch or straight after the council. And then there'd be a much greater chance that the written reply would simply be filling in the gaps, with a much lesser chance of having to resume. Because I think it's reasonable to assume that if you were to reply this afternoon, reduce them to writing sometime next week, we'd almost inevitably have to reconvene, I think, given the nature of what it is we anticipate you'll want to address. So how would you feel about taking a bit of extra time today to marshal your thoughts, as it were, reply orally tomorrow morning, and then reduce them to writing within a time frame to be agreed? Or would you say you're not going to be any further advanced tomorrow morning than you would be this afternoon?
Well, I wouldn't think so, sir, in the sense that given that we're going to be, I mean, the reply that I've prepared tonight is only short the people that we will hear from today, and we already know what they're saying. And it's more of a thematic reply than a detailed reply. But it'll be difficult overnight to do much better. But I'd be happy to do that if that's what you prefer, sir.
Well, if it's not going to add to it, and all you're going to do is present the same material tomorrow morning that you're going to present at lunchtime or after lunch, then there's probably not much point. Let's just see how things go. We'll ask you again at the end of the council presentation just where you think you're at, and we'll keep those options fluid. But be prepared to reply immediately, given that that's what you're already planning to do. But if it makes sense to change that, we will.
Thank you, sir. I'll take instructions by morning tea break.
Thank you. Do other council have any problem with what we're floating? Just happy to let that play out as it is. Mr. Laning, I can see nodding. I'm assuming that if people had a violent objection to anything, we'd have heard from them. So I think we'll proceed on that basis.
Yeah, and so I suppose we can use this technology if we have to have another brief meeting to address the written detailed submissions later on.
Yeah, we can. It's just a matter of fitting it in and all those sorts of things. But that's okay. We can work around all that. Okay. Sorry for all the palaver at the start. Maybe we can now get cracking. And first submitter this morning is Mr. White. Welcome.
Thank you. I have a presentation that I'll work through and share the screen with in a moment. So if I'm able to do that, that would be fantastic.
Yes, that's fine.
We have access now, Mr. White.
Fabulous, thank you. Before I do that, I just need to declare I have a number of hats that I wear. So one's the chair of the Huntly Community Board, and obviously I'm part also of the Ohinewai Area Committee. But this presentation is with my own personal hat on, my own personal views, me and my wife. The other thing is that Ohinewai infrastructure is fairly poor, especially with regards to internet. So periodically on Zoom calls, I have noticed that I will disappear off and require a reboot of my computer to restart. That's only happened once in the last 2 days, and I hope it doesn't happen in the next hour or so. But if I disappear, it's the reason why. And just another couple of comments before I start the presentation. My wife and I actually moved to Huntly for housing affordability and then commuted. I was working at the University of Waikato at the time and commuted back into Hamilton to do that, and she commuted to Auckland periodically. Obviously things have changed, and my wife was commuting into Hamilton as well from Ohinewai for a very long time until Sleepyhead development came along, and she said to me, oh, well, she's still commuting, and she said to me that there's the opportunity of her working locally if she's able to work with Sleepyhead. And so I've noticed some comments around commuting in the discussions that have come out. And so I find it interesting that my wife and I have already been acting as sleeper towns or sleeper residents in Huntly and in Ohinewai, and that the development would offer opportunities to our family to no longer commute because there would be work available locally, and I'll touch more on that later. But that is something that's been quite missing from the discussion so far, is the local input on how effectively we are already a sleeper town and a sleeper community, and the Ohinewai development would offer those jobs. And lastly, before I start, the focus will be on my immediate neighbour, but obviously the principles that I discussed can be rolled out over all the housing zone requests. So let's just start share screen, share. Okay, and slideshow, start from current slide. Okay, so that just so you've got the context. So it's my wife's points of view, personal points of view here. And to understand the context a bit further, this is Ohinewai, a zoom shot, a Google Earth shot. So you've got the interchange here, and this is the location of our property on Ohinewai North Road. And zooming in a wee bit closer so you can actually see the detail, this is our property here of half a hectare on a lifestyle block. And this area surrounding all of this area here is request to zone change from rural to country living, which is effectively from farm to lifestyle block. And I'm very well aware that development of those from rural to lifestyle blocks will bring a number of things that will be particularly unpleasant for me and our family. This is not a comprehensive list by any chance, but the obvious one is construction noise. They will obviously start early in the morning and work hard throughout the day, which will be an impact. There'll be a massive increase in traffic. At the moment, we're on a dead-end street. That's really fantastic. We get a couple of cars. We kind of know who's coming and who's going out of the street because we know everyone on the street and what they drive, but that will significantly reduce and we'll get lots more street noise. And a bugbear of mine is noisy recreation. People generally buy lifestyle blocks and then engage in recreation, which is obviously logical from their point of view. But we've noticed that people like motorbikes, kids like motorbikes, so they drive around. And I'm not a grumpy old man, but I loathe motorbikes and the noise they create. And it makes a big impact on the weekends when you hear them going up and down. Also, my kids have fortunately grown out of this stage and are kind of flying the coop, so to speak. But families have noisy kids. If you've got kids, they're noisy, and that's what kids do. But it's a pain for the others living around them, especially if you're used to the quiet of that area. And then they bring in noise. Excuse me. They bring in noise pollution, as people like to entertain. They like to use their stereos, and as a result, noise pollution. They also bring in light pollution, and we've noticed that even since living here, that our light pollution in the area has increased, and therefore we get a reduction in the number of stars we can see. As looking at the stars is something that I enjoy doing. So with the increase of street lights, I've particularly noticed a reduction in star viewing ability. and find that a negative consequence, and that will increase as development increases. And the other thing I have noticed that, unfortunately, due to perverse incentives from the local district council, there's been an increase in people burning plastics, and I find that really abhorrent, actually. It only takes a kilo of burning plastics to release enough toxic fumes to kill someone, and then that settles over the land as well, so it produces a bad smell and settles over the land. And I've noticed that people who burn materials, which is a common way of disposing of organic matter on lifestyle blocks, they will add a couple of sacks of rubbish or plastics into the mix, which is a very nasty way of disposing of plastics, but it seems to be socially acceptable. And lastly, as an example, is dog issues. I have a very dim view of dogs in general because they don't seem to be well trained. For example, if you go for walks along the streets in this area already, the dogs that are used to guard properties take a dim view of you walking past on the road, and generally bark and carry on. And so there seems to be an association in this country between people living in houses and dogs, and most people seem to be in a minority having a dim view of them. But they bring dog issues with development, which is another negative for our family. So the end result of development of lifestyle blocks and development in Ohinewai for housing will be a significantly reduced quality of life for me and my family. However, there's an ethical component, and I think ethics at the end of the day are very, very important. So I need to mention the ethics. And so, as already mentioned, we were renting in Hamilton and moved to Huntly. In the pictures there, our first time we moved on site into Huntly West, into one of the areas where it's a more challenging space to live, I guess is the nice way of saying that. And we did that because we couldn't afford to buy in Hamilton. So we couldn't, and we kept on buying, moving further and further out. And so it was either buying in Huntly or buying in Patauru. And since my wife was flying out of Auckland semi-regularly at the time, obviously Huntly was a better option. And reflecting last night upon the experiences in the street in Huntly West, and I realised that everyone who was employed, about 50% of people in the street were employed. Everyone who was employed commuted to Auckland, to Hamilton, to work, except for one person. That woman was a bloodsucker at the local blood remove, the medical centre, taking blood samples. And she actually, while we was there, she moved to Invercargill to pursue higher education and to train to become a nurse. So everyone else, though, who was employed commuted, and it was my first introduction to what was very standard and still is very standard in Huntly, that people would travel long distances to work every day. I'm thinking of the neighbour who I first met who worked in Auckland, and I had never heard of people commuting, well, it's an hour and a quarter without traffic in the morning. And so he was fortunate that he was commuting in the offset hours. But it is very common, and I would argue that Huntly was already a sleeper town or a sleeper.
How big was the street, Mr. White?
That's a very good question. It was a dead-end street of about 25 houses. So, okay. But I would assume that would be. I mean, the street was very typical of most of Huntly West, and the challenges that presents. And so, obviously, we lived in that first home for a while, and then in due course, that's now the first home Google Street View. We left and bought the lifestyle block where we currently live. And I also note on the street that we live on now, Ohinewai North Road, that we have workers who work and live on farms, on the farm there. But the majority of people who, well, everyone who works that I know of, again, commutes to Auckland or Hamilton or further away. There's a worker who commutes wherever his kind of work is, and often it can be further away than Hamilton. And only one person works locally, which is an electrician that I'm aware of in the street. And there's retired folk as well in the street. So again, in the street that I live in, in essence, it is a sleeper town where everyone commutes away in the morning, comes back at night. So from an ethics point of view, if I was to oppose development, what that would mean is that I'm restricting someone buying a lifestyle block, an opportunity that I've already had and I already enjoy, and I'm turning around and saying, I'm enjoying this, I'm living this good life, but no, sorry, you can't live this good life. And further to that kind of I've got it, but you can't have it attitude, you would actually be eliminating someone moving from another house, because people typically don't buy lifestyle blocks as their first home. And so therefore they would be selling somewhere else and moving into a lifestyle block. And so through that chain, whether it be a first home into a lifestyle block or through multiple homes into a lifestyle block, ultimately what we're saying is the person at the end of that chain who's renting and looking to buy their first home would not be able to do so because someone wouldn't be moving into a lifestyle block and freeing up the chain then of homes to be sold and eventually leading to a first home buyer buying a home. And so given that we have a shortage of housing stock in New Zealand and a housing crisis, as some people like to call it, to me, to say that we should not allow development, we should not allow lifestyle blocks, we should not allow housing development, is to say that we should have more people renting and more people enslaved in the renting loop, because it does enslave people. One of the ways of becoming, I guess, financially secure is to own your own home and to pay off the mortgage. And so if I was to oppose development, what I would be to say is the people who are enslaved or trapped in the renting cycle, well, they need to stay there, which I find personally very abhorrent and very unethical. And so therefore, from an ethical point of view, I am forced, even though it will come at personal cost to me and my family, to say that actually we support lifestyle block development in Ohinewai and housing development in Ohinewai because of the ethical implications, not because of our personal gain or our personal benefit. And it will come at a significant personal cost for us. But ethics at the end of the day are the most important thing in my mind. I just wanted to touch on, and I think this has already been touched on if I understood the conversation yesterday correctly, around failure, a probability of failure of stop banks, because we are in the defended area of 1 in 100 year defence, and I'm very aware of, I guess, the probability, or not the probability, but that we are in a defended area. This is a shot of Taupri, and I was talking to the Taupri chair of their community board just about another issue, and she mentioned quite rightly that the Taupri in the river, at Taupri, this is the township of Taupri here, or the hamlet of Taupri, that the river comes along and turns around quite significantly. And so in flood or in erosion states of the river, certain areas along where the river changes direction in this area erode out. And so she mentioned that she wouldn't feel comfortable buying riverfront property here because of the erosion potential and the erosion that does happen in states of flood. And so I thought about Ohinewai, and this is a shot of Ohinewai. You've got the interchange here, we live here, and you can see the river is effectively meandering along. So it's traveling in a straight line. So the erosion potential of the straight line is much reduced compared to, say, a place like Taupri. And then even though there is some obviously horizontal pressure produced by meandering rivers, and I personally feel that Ohinewai is a much better place for development and a much lower risk of having the stop banks attacked and destroyed in a flood event. So to me, the flood risk is much less than in other places that might be developed, and so thus be a better place for development. My understanding also, and correct me please if I'm wrong, that this submitter 804 has withdrawn a zone change request for industrial land on Ohinewai South Road. So therefore I won't talk to my part of my submission on that. And I also understand that the submitter 482, which was the request to Ohinewai to a growth area, has significantly altered the request and is now just focusing on some areas on, I've got to think about this, the other side of the railway line to where we are. So that's the east side of Ohinewai. So I don't have any comment on that. So that's my conclusions, which I've already talked about. So I will stop my sharing.
Thank you, Mr. White.
Are there any questions?
Let's find out. Mr. Marg?
Not at this point, thank you, Mr. White.
Mr. Fulton?
Thank you, Dave.
Mr. Kearney?
No, thanks, Mr. White. Thank you.
Mr. White, I do have a couple, and you acknowledged at the start that you wear multiple hats, so I'm not going to ask you to express a view on the community board per se, but I would just like a bit of background. I mean, we've received a letter from His Worship the Mayor explaining what the council's elected body considers, thinks about this proposal. What involvement has the community board, the Huntly Community Board that you chair, had in discussing as a group these proposals? And I'm going to ask you a specific question about Ambury, because your written submission talked about the Ambury proposal, but your presentation today has focused on the western side of the river. But I'll come to that in a minute. What involvement and what has the community board as an entity had to say about the future of Ohinewai?
The community board was elected, had elections late last year, and we were elected a number of new faces. I'm just trying to remember the exact numbers. I think 5 new faces on the board out of 6 community board members, and then the 2 councillors. And so the new community board, I've just got to be careful what words I choose here. The Huntly Community Board is exceptionally supportive of the development at Sleepyhead development, and is particularly upset that there hasn't been full support from everyone, I guess the powers that be. For us as Huntly, our major problem is jobs. The number one problem, if we could solve in Huntly, would be getting people into employment. And there is very, very few options in Huntly for employment. We were very supportive of the PBL slash smart build development in Huntly, because that's the only, well, it's one of the very, very few options for jobs in Huntly, and that was going to produce 60 more jobs. And to us, that's significant. So that's 60 more jobs for hopefully for locals, and that will make a difference in our community. So when someone comes along and says we're prepared to put hundreds of jobs on, I don't know the exact figure, but it's at least 100, maybe thousands of jobs into the community, it makes us very, very angry that people who live outside the community would say, no, Huntly, you can't have that opportunity, and no, Huntly, you can't have that opportunity to progress, to grow, to get people out of the multi-generational poverty that we have in Huntly. I won't say any more, but believe me, blood pressures are high, and there is full support of this project.
Would it be fair to say, just from the answer to your question, I wasn't going to ask you this, but you live at Ohinewai, you're on the Huntly Community Board, which straddles both areas, if you like, both Ohinewai and Huntly.
No, it is restricted to what I would call the Huntly urban area. So I actually.
I'm sorry. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. But notwithstanding that, does the Huntly Community Board see the Ohinewai proposals as being part of Huntly, irrespective of what the planning documents say? Do you perceive that the two as sort of coexisting or being completely separate? Or does the community, you and or the community board, if the community board has a view?
Huntly sees the development as being on the outskirts of Huntly, So they don't necessarily see the division as well. I'm very aware that many of, and I mentioned it in my next presentation with my Ohinewai area committee hat on, that many people commute their kids out from Huntly to the Ohinewai school. So even though it's a rural school, in essence, it's actually an urban school with some rural people. Ohinewai, on the other hand, are very adamant that they are not Huntly. So Ohinewai people are very aware, I guess, of the reputation Huntly has and that sort of positive reputation. And so they're very, very adamant that Ohinewai is Ohinewai, Huntly is Huntly, and that is the way that is. But Huntly people see Ohinewai as being, effectively Huntly.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much for your submission and your presentation.
Okay.
If you now want to take one hat off, put another one on,
Yes, yeah.
go again on behalf of the Ohinewai Area Committee.
Sure, and I will talk a wee bit before I start my presentation. Obviously, and this has been mentioned before, but I just want to mention it again, that our potential conflict of interest is that I'm the chair of the Huntly Community Board. Additional comments from the hearing that I have heard over the last few days is, and I've just touched on this before, is that the Ohinewai school has a large proportion of students commuting from Huntly. Now, I don't know the percentage breakdown between the two, but my gut feel would say more than 50% of the students are Huntly students, but I don't know, but that's my gut feel. So if you turn up at school leaving time or school drop-off time, there is a large amount of traffic coming down the expressway from Huntly, coming off at the Ohinewai roundabout, and then coming round into the school. And there's been so much pressure that the Ohinewai school actually put in a zone to make sure that people who are living in the Ohinewai area, their kids could still attend the school, because otherwise, the pressure from Huntly could potentially overwhelm that. And one of the concerns people have had living in Huntly is that if the development goes ahead at Ohinewai, that there will be less opportunity for urban Huntly kids to go to the Ohinewai school. The other thing that I have found I haven't been able to wrap my head around is the 1.2 kilometre distance for walking and biking commuting. And I suspect, actually my background as a researcher, so I used to work in the biotech industry, actually in the cow milking industry. So my background as a researcher tells me that 1.2 kilometres is probably based around an urban study. I don't know, I'm not kind of an expert in that area, because 1.2 kilometres to me with my rural hat on seems remarkably close. I mean, we were throwing our 6 or 7-year-old walking to school or biking to school 900 metres and didn't think about it. I mean, it was just, didn't even cross our minds that, that may be a long distance. And people on the other side of the railway, the whole time my kids were going through Ohinewai school, there were always kids crossing that very narrow bridge, very dodgy bridge with their bikes or walking from the residents in Lumsden's Road, and that everyone thought that was normal, and so given that that's obviously longer than 1.2 kilometres, to me 2 kilometres to walk to school or bike to school is nothing. So it's, to me, I question where that 1.2 kilometres came from and whether that's an urban analysis or a rural analysis. Also, and I've mentioned this before, is some residents work locally because they are fortunate enough to have jobs locally, but a large percentage of residents in Ohinewai already commute out to Auckland, to Hamilton, mostly South Auckland. I don't know anyone who commutes into CBD area or North Shore, so mostly South Auckland, but it's still a long commute. And also the Ohinewai Area Committee would proactively fight tooth and nail for any open cast mining. That would not be an option on the table for us. Also, Ohinewai Area Committee would not support opening up the Ohinewai South Road. So the Ohinewai South Road is a local road connecting to what will be eventually a connected local road. And it's a dead-end road, so low traffic, and it would be very upsetting for the residents there to have that opened up as that as a through road. And lastly, before I start my presentation, I'm aware, and I've kind of learning on the fly here, that this hearing is quite different from a resource consent hearing. And so some of the information that I discussed might be more applicable to the resource consent stage, but I've included it in here because I'm not entirely sure of the difference, and I'm sure that the learned people involved will be able to kind of figure out what was appropriate and what can be left. Now, turn this on again. Turn this on again. Cool. Okay. So I mentioned also it's important to mention that the chair is Peter Brown, who's a local farmer and has been here in the community for generations and is a really good bloke. And the secretary is Catherine, who may or may not, who has made another submission on her personal behalf. I'm kind of the guy who has the time and the I won't say comfortable, but semi-comfortable presenting. So hence I'm the presenter on behalf of the board, the area committee. And so I will walk through 4 areas. One, we'll talk about the Waikato District Council blueprints, and then the Waikato District Council 2070 plan and the submission we made to that as a committee. And then we will talk about the concerns around high density housing and make additional comments. So that's the 4 areas of the presentation today. So the blueprint process started at the same time that the Ambury development was flagged and I guess became public that was going on. And the blueprint process was the council going to all communities in their area saying, if you had a magic wand and you could make things magically happen in your community, what would your key areas be? What would you make happen? What would you want in your future? And so what became very clear for the Ohinewai community, there were 2 things they wanted. One was they wanted lifestyle block developments. And so they wanted a nice community full of, lifestyle blocks with folks who kind of thought the same and had the same attitude and outlook on life. And the second thing they wanted was access over the expressway, foot traffic, railway, pedestrian traffic, biking access over the railway line and the expressway. The railway line and the expressway cut through our community and it divides our community. And the only way at the moment to safely get across that is via a car. I actually walked for the first, well, not the first time, but I didn't, during lockdown when there was virtually no traffic at all, I walked across the railway bridge there a number of times. And each time I walked across it, I went, I do not feel comfortable here. I would not let my kids walk across here because it is too narrow and too uncomfortable. And other feedback included that they would like a local cafe close to the river and renovation of Cowboys, which is a derelict building, which is quite prominent on the west side of the expressway, which is an eyesore to the residents because of its prominent position. So effectively asking for a rejuvenation and places of business to service the local area. So that's kind of the core view. Now, we also made a submission to the Waikato District Council 2070 plan, which is trying to look long-term and say, what do you want long-term in the communities? And I will walk through the submission that we made to that panel, I guess, for want of a better word, now. So when the blueprint came out, we modified it using just a simple paint program to what we would prefer. And so this is Ohinewai here. So you can see this is the interchange here, State Highway 1. This is, and this was marked on as the Ambury development, labelled as the Ohinewai South Industrial Cluster. And it has been mentioned, but I would like to emphasise that the Ohinewai North Industrial Cluster, as it's labelled, there's a large industrial development that sits there. So we've got a large sawmill, we've got a tannerization plant. There's also a depot for storage of houses for a house moving company. There's also other industrial, small industrial buildings there that seems to change semi-regularly who's operating out of them. But it is a large area that you can see from the expressway. And so we wrote in that ideally, and this is the section size for housing, that the Ohinewai Area Committee would love it if this was all lifestyle blocks through here. but we understand realistically, because we're realistic folks, that the Ohinewai South Industrial Cluster, the application is in process, so we accept that that may be, you know, part of the future for Ohinewai, but we would definitely like this area to the west of the expressway to be lifestyle blocks, and possibly, and ideally, given that it's a 50-year plan, that this would be lifestyle blocks out along the Tahuna Road here area. The reason that we haven't pushed these lifestyle blocks further out kind of these ways is the lack of roading access, is the fact that, especially out here around the lakes, there'd be no way that you'd be building out this way due to a flood risk, etc., etc., etc. So it seemed to us the easy places to build, and hence the highlight in the yellow as residential build as lifestyle blocks. Now, as already mentioned in the blueprints, the blueprint access across this interchange was a key thing for the community. And so when Amber came along and said, one of the key things we've noticed is the lack of access here, and we would like to provide that as part of the development, people in the Ohinewai committee said, or in the community said, this is a good thing. And so I've drawn it here. Obviously, it's proposed to be further south, but when we put in this submission, we weren't aware of that. So hence the drawing is next to the existing access. So having pedestrian access across is a big deal to the Ohinewai community, and it's a big deal that Amber proactively suggested that to the community, but they didn't wait for the community to say we wanted access. They came along and said, well, we need access. This is logical, which is a very positive step. And obviously there's a range of views in the community about the development, from very negative through to relatively positive. But overall, the community was very impressed that Amber was proactive in suggesting access, pedestrian access across the things that cut our community. And so with that in mind, in the 2070 plan, we said we accepted Sleepyhead because of the access. And obviously having more people there working there, that means we have the possibility of a cafe somewhere. And also for us, which is quite important, is a petrol station. We don't have petrol stations nearby. So we've got to commute into Huntly to get petrol or go north to get petrol. So having a local petrol station, and also a petrol station typically operates as a dairy, is a good thing, because at 8 o'clock at night, when you need, you know, a pound of butter or whatever you need, you have to go into the supermarket to Huntly to get that. So having a local spot would reduce the amount of traffic on the expressway. So we also said, well, obviously appreciated that there was not just industrial proposed, and the Ohinewai committee doesn't support the high density housing, but does support and I'll talk more about that later. But it did support the mixed development, including commercial and residential. Now we appreciate that the commercials come off the table, but when we put in the 2070 plan, that's still on the table. So our last slide for the 2070 plan looked like this, where we've got lifestyle blocks in yellow, supported the commercial, which has now been removed, and the industrial cluster. So moving on to, I guess, our key concerns here is that the high density living is the concern. So it's not the living or having people live there, it's the fact that it's in high density and is quite different to anything that is currently in Huntly, and is quite different to anything that's obviously in Ohinewai. And so we see some negative effects of that, and how negative those effects are kind of depends on various things, and I'll talk about those issues going forward. One question which is rather inconvenient to ask, and maybe not politically correct is not the right word, but could be seen that way, is that are we getting a mixed development where the managers and the people who already own homes in Auckland, you know, and are well off, are they going to come down and live in Ohinewai, or is it a place just for factory workers? Because this makes a difference in the community, the makeup of the community, the diversity of the community, the connections that it can be easily made throughout the Amber community and then the wider Ohinewai community. And it's something that we haven't seen as a committee, whether there's been a buy-in of senior management and everyone, you know, through the management chain, and also including factory workers, to live in the Ohinewai area, proposed development area, or whether they will live elsewhere in the Waikato and then commute in to the Ohinewai factory. So to us, that's an important issue that hasn't been fleshed out. The other issue is the city to country development or culture shock. Obviously, in the city, you've got lots of things you can go to. You've got lots of activities to engage your kids. You've got connections you've already made. There's a vibrancy in the city. My middle child is currently studying in downtown Auckland, and she's a city girl. And really, she comes home every now and then, says hello, we love you, and I'm going back to the far more interesting city because Ohinewai's, she doesn't say it, but Ohinewai's a whole, which I quite like Ohinewai. I mean, that's why we live here, but she's a city girl. And so people will be coming from the city with all of their attractions and all of their entertainment and all the things they can do to a location that has effectively nothing. And so there's going to be some social cost with that. So culture shock and, importantly, bored and frustrated youths. And we all know that bored and frustrated youths, that's not a good thing. So we don't want that. Now, obviously, there might be some ways to mitigate this. There might be ways of working with local communities of faith to develop those relationships with local kura and schools to develop those relationships. And maybe a community centre needs to be built as the first part of the development. I don't know the staging and the details of the staging, but obviously developing community centres and things for the first people who arrive to do is very, very important to stop people getting bored and frustrated and going through culture shock and struggling with all of that. The other concern that we really do have is in a company town, what happens when the company goes bankrupt? And obviously nobody from Ambury wants to go bankrupt, and we acknowledge that they have been in business for a number of decades, but we all are aware that due to circumstances beyond anyone's control, Ambury could find itself very rapidly going bankrupt. As COVID's showing, you know, there's all sorts of things that can suddenly appear out of nowhere and stop businesses from being productive or making money. And bankruptcy is something that Huntly has experienced multiple times. Not necessarily bankruptcy outright, even though that was what happened with Solid Energy. Went bankrupt overnight, and suddenly the last major employer of the town disappeared overnight. But things like the Huntly Power Station has changed from a major employer to a minor employer due to changing, I guess, dynamics and the change in how that's operated, etc., etc. So even though Huntly Power Station is still in operation, from a local point of view, it's effectively like the company has vacated the town. And if something went into receivership, we're very aware that the homes would be sold up by the receivers. So in a bankruptcy situation, they would be sold on the open market, typically at a low price. And so what we would end up with, instead of a vibrant community at Ohinewai, we would end up with a slum in Ohinewai, which is something that obviously the Ohinewai Area Committee is very concerned about and is very anxious that that does not happen. There are possible solutions. The obvious one is to make homes transportable so that the owners, if they are you know, working out the ownership or in process of owning, that they can put their home on a truck and move it. And transportable homes are built in a factory production line method in Huntly and at a very realistic price. But we're not aware of many other options that there are available to make sure that if there's a bankruptcy situation or a fire sale situation, that we don't end up with, you know, slum Ohinewai with people trapped in that area and no employment. Last, I don't know if this is lastly actually, but there's a potential for poor sales, and this is a real concern for us. So if, and this is what I snapped off last week, so this is Huntly house prices. This is entry level. And so you can see here for under $400,000, you can get a 3-bedroom home that probably needs some love in a not so great part of town, but it comes with a significant section. So even this one down here in James Henry, that comes with 700 square meters, which is enough to put a tent on, to have whānau around during the summer to play a bit of cricket on the ground. You know, you have that, I guess, Kiwi dream of some grass to mow and some a house to live in. And to me, I mean, this is why we moved to Huntly. If I was looking at the difference between a $500,000 property and a $350,000, $400,000 property, that's a huge difference in terms of mortgage serviceability. And so if people were getting their first home, I might suggest they might buy their first home in Huntly as opposed to Ohinewai. And TK, as it's known, or Tika Whara, as it's the full name, has a very good reputation, and they've worked very hard there to maintain their reputation. And this is the prices of their entry-level homes in TK at the moment. And so you can see here for 570,000, so that's not much more than that the houses are being discussed in Ohinewai. You could buy a 4-bedroom home with 2 toilets on a section. And so this is a nice modern home. This is a good home in a good location. And so my assumption would be, if management were coming down, or those who had a house and they were selling to come down, they would most likely live in TK, because you can buy a nice house in a nice section in a nice part of town and reap the benefits from that. And so therefore the incentive to buy at Ohinewai and walk to work is much less or non-existent, since TK is just up the road. And there's been a recent development in TK, which is called Lakeside. And this is currently what they're offering on in Trade Me. And so you can see here, for about 500,000, you can buy a small home on a small section. And these are very close together and very close to the model that Ambry is proposing of high density housing. So to us, this is the closest example of high density housing in the area that we can point to. And Lakeside started, and as you can see, have been employed, has been sold by Bailey's, which is generally a top class real estate company. And they've pushed it very hard, had very nice brochures. They've talked very much about how there's going to be, there's no space for you to play cricket, but there's going to be parks for you to play cricket, that there'll be wide spaces so you can ride your bike around the subdivision. So it's all the fancy high density living, but we've got amenities that people can go to and walk to and engage with, which is exactly what Amber is talking about. And yet their sales have been abysmal. Really, really abysmal. And so therefore the developers looked to other options. And so what was Kyangarora, if I said that correctly, Ex-Housing New Zealand has come up and bought 50%. That's the rumour. I don't know if that's true. But the word on the street is 50% of the houses in that subdivision. And so that's going to have enormous implications for TK and for that subdivision and for those people around that subdivision. And so our concern is that a similar thing is going to happen in Ohinewai, that the housing is not going to be sold. And so therefore Ambry is going to look for someone to buy that, as you would, and that's going to be turning out to be something like Housing New Zealand or another social service housing group, or sold off to investors who will then rent them out at minimum prices. And so we are very concerned about that as a committee. And so safeguarding the community from that, I think, is very important. And so restricting the obvious solution to that is restricting the numbers that can be sold to external people or to Housing New Zealand or to social housing. But yes, we are very aware that the closest model to what has been proposed has done particularly poorly. Okay, just a couple of other notes from things that have been discussed when we're putting this presentation together. Anyway, Area Committee really does acknowledge that in Huntly there is no space for greenfield development of this size. There is just not the space, and I find it very difficult to believe that people would say there is space. The people who say that clearly don't understand Huntly, to be blunt. We've got the river, we've got the rail corridor, we've got mine tailings, we've got subsidence zones, we've got swamps, we've got really steep hills. You know, Huntly it was mentioned that it was over 8 kilometres long yesterday. Well, that's because there's nowhere for you to go except for on the hills or, you know, in the days of old next to the river. And so it's a long, thin town because there's nowhere, you just can't go sideways. And people would prefer to go sideways, but you just can't. And so, yeah, people who say there's space in Huntly for these homes or even this industrial development show their naivety and lack of understanding of Huntly. And this has already been covered, that Ohinewai has basic public transport, so it's pretty cool when my daughter by the university in Waikato jumps on a bus at 5 o'clock or whatever it is and buses up and then pops out at Ohinewai. I think that's really cool. And so and we've had indications that this service will increase naturally over time, irrespective of whether Amber is going to turn up or not. And so that's neat. And I'm also very aware that the Northern Connector, which is the name for the bus run from that comes up from bus depot in Hamilton and up through the northern towns, has the highest occupancy rate over the whole network. And so it is very guiling when Waikato Regional Council turn around and say it's not economic or whatever to support Ohinewai. It wouldn't be. Well, this is the run that has the most usage out of all of their runs. So I don't know what's going on there, and you can see that. So for example, the only double-decker bus that runs in the network comes to Huntly already. It doesn't come to Ohinewai, but it comes to Huntly. And that causes issues in Huntly due to the size and the fact that it couldn't fit under certain bridges. But, you know, the Northern Connector is used, and it's used by a huge number. I can't remember the figures, but it's a massive number of people. And that's used by workers and students. And I mean, the other thing, not to get sidetracked here, is that more students bus out of Ohinewai. Oh, sorry. More students commute out of Huntly to schools outside of Huntly than go to schools inside of Huntly. So more students go out of town for schooling than stay in the town for schooling. And buses is one of the ways they do that. And that's obvious in the morning if you sit in Huntly. The other thing that should be mentioned, so this is a map here. So this is Ohinewai. This is Ohinewai School here. The other day, and so this is Ohinewai South Road that now connects on through here, and there's vaguely pedestrian access at the end here that gets you onto what is the old State Highway 1, which now has very little traffic on it. I was coming home along this Thermal Explorer Highway, just a bit further south than this here, and there was a kid in an Ohinewai school uniform riding on a little motorised electric scooter coming down the side of the road because he lives in the north end of Huntly. And so I thought that was really interesting that already well, at least one family had decided that it was safe for their child to commute from the northern end part of Huntly all the way up to Ohinewai School, which I thought was really good. And with that connection being there, I've contemplated getting my bike working again to bike into Huntly. I haven't quite got there. And I don't know if I ever will, to be honest, but when I was in Huntly, I used my bike quite a lot. But I'm very aware that these connections are now there and now starting to be used. So to summarise, yes, the Ohinewai Area Committee accepts the industry there because of the benefit of giving the access over the state highway. We would have accepted commercial, and we thought a commercial was a good idea. Yes to low density homes or homes in general, not opposed to that in principle, but we're very concerned about the high density homes and the impact that will have on the community. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. White. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. White, and thank you for your presentation. No, I don't have any questions. I think you've illustrated very well your committee's position, so thank you very much.
Mr. Marg?
Great presentation, Mr. White, and thank you for, I guess, highlighting some of the key concerns around Huntly have already been raised for you to, I guess, personify it around. There are no greenfield development opportunities in Huntly, and it's based on your experience. But can I just ask you a question about the Ohinewai Area Committee, the makeup of the committee, and how the committee is elected and the number of people that it represents?
So the Ohinewai Committee is geographically defined by the council.
Right.
So it obviously, and it kind of goes up, I tried to find a picture, but it goes up towards Rangariri, it goes south towards Huntly and then goes east, a fair distance east. And so geographically, Ohinewai Area Committee is made up, I guess, of farms and then the Ohinewai settlement, and it's spread out. It's elected, people are elected at the AGM to a maximum, I think, of 12 people on the committee. And I don't know, I think we're around 10 at the moment, or 11. And so generally speaking, there's some farmers on the committee, but it is majoritarily made up of people who are living in lifestyle blocks. And also there's some retired folks who are on lifestyle blocks as well, or smaller sections than that. And we attempt to engage the whole of the community, but as you would be well aware, engaging a community on mostly council matters and things like that is generally quite difficult. Sometimes we have in the past physically canvassed people living on the streets and door knocked and asked people stuff, but most of the time we rely on the connections that people have into the community. So I'm a newbie. I've been here not yet a decade, but a large number of people on the committee have been here the whole life, so they kind of know everyone, they know everyone's name, they wander around and talk to people, and so we kind of rely on the informal networks of people to give us an indication of what people are thinking. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, look, that's fantastic. Just from a point of view, from hearing that from the panel point of view, having a sense of confidence that your representation is obviously not about 5 or 10 people, and the views that you're provided within the PowerPoint is actually indicative of quite a few people.
We feel confident in that. Cool. With my scientist hat on, I do wonder, statistical validity and how many, but we represent those who have chosen to, I guess, engage.
Ka pai, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Mark. Mr. Kearney.
Thanks, Mr. White. It's refreshing to get evidence from someone who lives in the area, both at Huntly and also in Ohinewai. So thank you for that. Just a couple of questions. Huntly, has it become a dormitory town? Do people go out of Huntly to get employment?
Absolutely. There is no... Yes, absolutely.
And where do they go?
Auckland. Auckland and Hamilton is the simple answer. I'm surprised, given the length of time it takes to commute to Auckland in the morning, because I've got stuck in traffic sometimes, how many people go to Auckland, but the majority of people will go to Hamilton, simply because it's closer. But yes, the amount of people who commute to Auckland has really surprised me.
We've heard a lot of evidence that Ohinewai, the development, Sleepyhead development, may become a dormitory town because a lot of people will not be working there and going off to Huntly for services and other places. The estimates for job creation at Ohinewai are something like 2,000 or 2,600, one of the figures. Yeah, it was a high figure anyhow. What's your view on the experts, or some experts saying this will become a dormitory town like the others? What's your...
I would look at it as a sum total. So obviously people in TK commute to Auckland and Hamilton and Pukekohe. So I would look at it as a sum total of commute in terms of, let's assume for a moment that everyone who lives in Ohinewai, no one wants to work in the local development. And so that becomes a purely dormitory town. Okay, and then we add in the extra jobs of 2,600 jobs, and a large percentage of those I suspect would come from Huntly, TK, and the surrounding area, and those folks are already commuting to Hamilton or Auckland. So you've suddenly got a whole bunch of people not commuting to Hamilton and Auckland, and you've got people in Ohinewai in this development commuting out. And I, on a gut level, feel, because again, I haven't run the numbers, I haven't seen the numbers, I would say that that would result in a net decrease in using the expressway to commute.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
Thank you.
At worst, and that's at worst case scenario.
Yeah. Thank you. The other one thing is you mentioned access, that you discussed with Sleepyhead access across the state highway and rail being made available. Could you just explain that? What was that about?
When they came forward with their proposal, they said that they saw one of the key issues of the community was that there was no pedestrian access across the state highway through the interchange and across the rail bridge on the other end of the interchange. And so one of their key parts of their proposal they put to the community was that they would provide pedestrian access across the from the east side to the west side or the west side to the east side. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I sort of haven't picked that up, but that might be because of my lack of observation in the design plans.
It was discussed as being now terminating at the school instead of being close to the interchange. They were talking about having it across at the school and then transiting across a bit of farmland.
Okay.
As I understand it, Mr. White, the proposal is to move it further south.
Yeah.
There's some further discussions to be had because Ambury don't have access to all that land. And those, as I understand it, those discussions have been ongoing but haven't yet resolved themselves. But I think it is shown on the master planning documents, and I think it may, I'm not sure if it's in the structure plan, but it's certainly in the master plan.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, now I understand. Yeah, I thought you meant the direct access across the busy intersection there, but it's,
yeah, well, I mean that's what we assumed would happen, but it doesn't really matter where it is. I mean, I prefer it to be at the interchange because it's close to my house, but it's.
You're optimistic the kids would use this access from the east to go to schools. You're quite confident of that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If it was there, it would be used already.
They breed the kids tough down there, eh?
Oh yeah, uphill both ways.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I don't have any question. I'm surprised though that Mr. Marg didn't recount his stories of going to school. I think he walked about 50 miles in the morning barefooted in the snow, backwards and forwards, 5 days a week. But
Slight exaggeration, Mr. Chair. It was only 46 miles.
Anyway, I don't have any questions, Mr. White. Thank you very much for your very thoughtful presentation.
Yeah, very good,
appreciate
sir.
it. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, folks.
I think what we might do is we're sort of coming to not a pause point, but we sort of change tack after this presentation. So I think we might take our morning adjournment now till 10:30, and we'll come back at 10:30, and we're due to hear then from the Ralph Estate, followed by Ohinewai Lands, and then others to follow. So we'll adjourn now and we'll be back at 10:30. Thank you. Just for those that haven't been involved in the hearings up until now, don't log off. If you could just mute your microphone, and if you wish, close your video down, but don't actually make a disconnection, because sometimes there's an issue in getting back on. System, please. Thank you. Okay, everybody, we'll resume. Now we're going to hear from the Ralph Estate. Ms. Mitchell, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. I'm counsel for the Ralph Estates. I'm going to briefly speak to my legal submissions. I don't propose to read them in full. I have with me today, although not in the same room as me unusually, Dean Ferguson and Gary Grant, who've both lodged evidence, and they'll briefly speak to their evidence as well. And also Julie Wright from the Public Trust, which manages the Ralph Estates, in case you have any questions of her. Right, so I'll begin. The Ralph Estates hold extensive mineral titles around Rotowaru, Huntly and Ohinewai, including under and adjacent to some of the land that is subject of the submission seeking rezoning, and APLs in particular. These mineral titles provide unfettered rights of access to the surface land to mine their minerals, subject to providing reasonable compensation for land damage. The Ralph Estates opposes APL's submission because their mineral interests would be effectively sterilised if the properties were rezoned to provide for urban development. In terms of the other submitters, the Ralph Estates wants to ensure that any amendments to the proposed plan to give effect to the relief sought in those submissions do not adversely affect the ability for the Ralph Estates to utilise their mineral rights in the future. So a brief explanation of who the Ralph Estates are. Anthony and Margaret Ralph established the Topuria Coal Mining Company in 1874, and over the next 30 years the Ralph family purchased extensive land titles that included the rights to minerals in the Waikato district. Most of the surface land was subsequently sold, but the Ralph Estates retained the mineral titles and the right to enter the land to mine those minerals. Minerals owned by the Ralph Estates have been mined for almost 150 years, and mining continues today in the Rotowaru coalfield under a renewed mineral lease and mining agreement. And what's really important to note here is this consistent historical pattern of mining. The nature of the mining operations have changed as the technology has changed, and what was feasible 150 years ago is different to what is feasible now. If you take the Rotowaru coalfield as an example, before it was developed, that would have been inconceivable, and then technology changed and it became a feasible operation. So today the Ralph Estates are administered by the Public Trust, and there are over 80 beneficiaries. In section 3 of my submissions, I set out an introduction to my witnesses, and you'll hear from them shortly. They're very experienced mining consultants. Turning to the Ralph Estates mineral interests, which is section 4 of my submissions. The Ralph Estates mineral titles include all minerals, including coal, aggregates, sand, gravels, etc., peat, fireclay, greywacke, and other minerals not reserved to the Crown that may be present in the land. This is an important point. While our evidence focuses on the coal, the resources are much broader than that. And many of these other minerals, such as the aggregates, are closer to the surface and much easier to access, and Mr. Ferguson may have some additional comments on that. Now, the titles provide unfettered rights of access to the surface land to mine the minerals, subject to providing reasonable compensation for land damage. The Commissioners asked a question of Mr. Berry on Monday about whether these are legal rights to access the land. In my submission, they are. They're historical titles, over 100 years old. Some of the language refers to horses and carts, but then importantly, or any other appliance. And so in my submission, we do have a legal right to access the land and take the minerals that the Ralph Estates own. Now, Mr. Ferguson's evidence provides a map and a detailed description of the Ralph Estates mineral interests. In short, those mineral interests under and adjacent to the land that is the subject of the APL proposal include a very substantial quantity of coal resources in the Waikari coalfield. These coal resources and the related geotechnical and mining challenges, environmental effects and economics have been extensively explored, investigated and assessed over the past 40 years, first as part of the New Zealand Coal Resources Survey and then by Solid Energy. In the original Section 42A report, the reporting officer noted that there was no information to suggest that the mineral resource was significant enough to preclude rezoning. So that was the purpose of the evidence that we filed, to sort of fill that information gap. It's important to note that this isn't just historical exploration. A series of open cast mine proposals have been developed. The most recent proposal was developed by Solid Energy as recently as 2015. In Mr. Ferguson's opinion, an open cast mine at Ohinewai is technically feasible. His expert opinion after 35 years in the mining industry is that it would be economic at the mine scale proposed by Solid Energy and anticipated production level, even when the capital requirements are considered. In his opinion, there is a sufficient long-term market for this coal, and he'll explain to you why he doesn't agree with Mr. Lyons on that matter. It is recognised that resource consents would be required to realise the economic value. While Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Lyons agree that open cast mining at Ohinewai would pose a number of technical challenges, Mr. Ferguson's evidence is that those technical challenges are not insurmountable, and there are in fact feasible solutions to the issues raised in Mr. Lyons' evidence. On that point, sir, in my submission, in the absence of a resource consent application for a mining operation, which would include measures to avoid, remedy, mitigate effects or provide environmental compensation, it's simply not possible to say that it is inconceivable that a resource consent would be granted, or inconceivable that the effects wouldn't be significantly adverse, as Mr. Berry suggested to you on Monday. Mr. Ferguson talks about having a whole toolkit of measures to address the adverse effects of coal mines, and he can answer questions on that when he presents. The next section of my submissions relates to the sterilisation of the Ralph Estates mineral interests. I won't read this in full, but the key point is that the APL proposal seeks to rezone land directly above 2 of the Ralph Estates mineral titles north of the Tahuna Road. There are 3 consequences to this. First, clearly the APL proposal would have a direct impact on the Ralph Estate's ability to access its mineral interests. Once the Sleepyhead estate is constructed, practically the Ralph Estates would not be able to enter the land and mine the minerals within or beneath the surface. Second, it's not just the coal directly underneath the Sleepyhead estate that would be affected. It would also reduce the extent to which the minerals south of Tahuna Road could be accessed. The mine would need to be significantly smaller. And third, the Ralph Estates has real concerns about its ability to carry out mining operations in proximity to a large, high-density residential community of the nature that Sleepyhead is proposing. Mr. Ferguson's evidence quantifies the volume of the sterilised coal, and Mr. Gray has valued it between $4.1 million and $7 million. Turning to the statutory tests, in summary, the assessment that is required when making a decision on proposed plan provisions has been broadly summarised by the Environment Court to distill down to an evaluation of which provisions are the most appropriate. In my submission, changes to the rural zoning to provide for residential, industrial and business uses cannot be the most appropriate, when these changes will effectively prevent the owner of the minerals beneath the surface from being able to make reasonable, or indeed any use of their interest in the land in question. Retaining the site's rural zoning will allow the land to continue to be put to economic use in a manner that is appropriate in the context of the small rural village that it neighbours. It would not preclude the ability for those that own the minerals underneath the surface to exercise their rights in the future to obtain the necessary authorisations, including resource consents, and access the land to remove those minerals. Turning to section 85 of the RMA, it is also my submission that the proposed rezoning would render the Ralph Estates mineral interests incapable of reasonable use in terms of section 85. Section 85(2) and 3 provide the opportunity for a submitter on a proposed plan to challenge the proposed provisions on the basis that they would render the submitter's interest in land incapable of reasonable use. The short point, sir, is that the Ralph Estates mineral titles are an interest in the land, and the APL proposal would render that interest incapable of reasonable use. Mr. Berry pointed you to the definition of reasonable use on Monday, to say that a coal mine wouldn't meet this definition because of the likely level of effects. I've already addressed you on the fact that there are a toolkit of measures to address adverse effects, and it's not a foregone conclusion that those effects would be significant. He also referred to effects that would be significant on APL. The Ralph Estates acknowledges that if the land was rezoned and the Sleepyhead estate proceeds, a mining operation would have effects on APL. That is the very reason it is opposed to the rezoning. As discussed in the evidence of Mr. Ferguson, while obtaining a resource consent for an open cast coal mine is not straightforward, it is nevertheless possible. I understand it's a discretionary activity. And as I discussed earlier, it's not just the coal that the Ralph Estates owns, their titles include aggregates and fire clay, which are much closer to the surface. Therefore, in our submission, the Ralph Estates has grounds to challenge the APL proposal under section 85 through this hearings process. The panel should not approve provisions that will have this effect on the Ralph Estates interests. Turning to section 85.3, in the event that the panel is minded to allow the relief sought by APL, the Ralph Estates will have no option but to lodge an appeal with the Environment Court to pursue the remedies provided in section 85.3a as part of the relief sought. And my submissions discuss the process in the context of amendments made to the RMA in 2017 to broaden the remedies available to affected landowners. I won't read this out in full, but this part of the submissions provides really useful context of the parliamentary intent to provide remedies for landowners in the situation that the Ralph Estates finds itself in. If the Environment Court agrees that a provision will make an interest in land incapable of reasonable use and places an unfair and unreasonable burden on the person with that interest, it can give the local authority the option to acquire the interest in the land if that is their preference, rather than amending the provision. Turning to my conclusion, the submitters, and APL in particular, seek to change the operative rural zoning, which has been carried through in the notified proposed plan, to residential, industrial and business zoning and associated changes to the provisions of the proposed plan. It's the Ralph Estates' position that the changes sought by the submitters are not the most appropriate planning provisions. The relief sought in the submissions will effectively prevent the Ralph Estates from being able to make reasonable or indeed any use of their interests in the land in question. The submissions should be rejected and the rural zoning retained. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. Let's just see if there's any questions. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just one question comes to mind. Would it be possible for Sleepyhead to negotiate a buyout of the rights for the coal or the extraction industry that they own?
Yes, that would be possible, but that hasn't occurred at this stage.
Thank you.
Mr. Mark?
Yes, Ms. Mitchell, can you just clarify for me in relationship to your, I think you said the titles go back near on 100 years?
Yes.
And so therefore, over the years that have gone by, and not considering the APL proposition, but the current previous owners that were farming the land.
Yes.
And you referred to Solid Energy putting forward a proposal in 2015 to look at open cast. How would the farmer have been compensated if an open cast mine was approved?
How would the farmer have been compensated? Well, that would have been a commercial arrangement between Solid Energy and the farmer.
You referred to the RMA and around the opportunity and to utilise the land. I think you were referring to Section 85, and you would be using that to RE's Ralph Estate advantage. What if the farmer who bought the land, that's a huge disruption in their life, the historical people that were on the land, isn't?
Yes, but they purchased land where they only owned the surface.
Right.
They purchased land on top of a coal resource with a coal interest retained to the Ralph Estates.
And knowing that this proposition was put forward by Solid Energy, prior to it going bankrupt, but 40 years have gone by and nothing has been considered around this particular area in an open cast mine apart from that.
Mr. Ferguson will be able to provide more evidence on that, but my understanding is that an information memorandum was being prepared to go out to investors. And while that was being prepared, Mr. Ferguson read an article in the Herald about Sleepyhead's proposal and alerted the public trust.
Right, so it's just the timing, it's a coincidence.
It's a coincidence.
Yeah, in relationship to...
Yeah, so when the articles in the Herald appeared about the Sleepyhead proposal, the Ralph Estates lodged a further submission to protect their interests. The time for lodging a primary submission had passed.
Thank you for that.
Mr. Kearney?
Ms. Mitchell, does the Ralph estate have legal right of access to access below the surface, or does it have access to come on to the surface of the land and mine? There is a distinction.
Yes, there is, to come onto the surface. So if I won't read the whole thing, but just to give you a flavour, excuse the language, it's 100 years old. The grantor doth grant the mines, beds, veins and seams of coal and fire clay and other minerals within or under all the lands, together with the full liberty and power to enter into or upon or occupy the said lands and premises, and be and remain therein and thereon for the purpose of carrying on and working the mines. And then later on, it talks about with or without horses, carts, or other appliances.
All right. Okay. How you mentioned this provision for compensation. Is that in the document as well?
Yes, so it's a very complex picture. There's a number of titles, as you will have seen from the Ralph Estates submission, which attaches them. And they, it would need to be something that would be worked through at the time of a proposal, because it's a sort of complex, the very different transfers grant different rights in terms of making good the land or providing compensation. And so at the time of taking a proposal for a mine forward, that would be the time at which those arrangements would need to be worked through in detail.
So it didn't provide any statutory basis or any other, it just said compensations payable, and that left it at that, did it?
Yes, and not in as clear language as that, obviously, given the age. And I think it's important to note that open pit coal mining has only been around since the 1940s, I understand, and these titles predate that. So there would be some work at the time of pursuing a mining proposal to ascertain exactly what permissions and compensations arrangements were required.
So you got that commercial direction to go and negotiate compensation, and then you're also coming under you're trying to get under Section 85, aren't you, of the RMA?
Yes.
And is that really the reason underpinning this submission, is to preserve your rights to bring a claim under Section 85?
No, because Section 85 is very rarely used, and the new remedies have only been in there since 2017. Our purpose here is to rely on Section 32 and the elements that must be shown for a provision to be the most appropriate. And it is our submission that they're not the most appropriate under Section 32.
So so getting back to the planning merits, your case is, well, this land shouldn't be rezoned at all. It should be simply left as it is, and that situation should continue into the foreseeable future, because you don't know whether you're going to apply for a mining license or not. That's the sort of overview we've got?
What I'm saying, sir, is that the land is currently zoned rural. It's currently being used to a productive economic use in a small rural village. And as part of the balance, when you're considering whether these provisions are appropriate, one of the factors to consider, in conjunction with all the other effects that have been raised in relation to the rezoning, one of those matters is the fact that a third-party landowner owns the minerals underneath the land in question.
And it has done so since the last century, yet there's nothing been done on the land in that respect.
So those minerals in particular have not been mined, but the Ralph Estate has been mining their interest for over 150 years. Okay. And there have been extensive, Mr. Ferguson can take you through it, there's been extensive work assessing the nature of that interest and how a mining operation would take place.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. Can I just clarify a couple of things and helpfully you've read out that passage from the title, which I think I understand. It sounded more like Shakespeare than modern legal drafting, but I think I understand the gist of it. Mr. Ferguson at paragraph 4.6 of his evidence says that there is unfettered access to the land that's reserved, subject to compensation. Doesn't that mean that in the event of any dispute, given that there are effectively two title holders for the same geographical area, mean that it's a civil matter to arrange compensation as opposed to a Section 85 matter?
Certainly, sir, that would be an option, but I think the Ralph Estates is pursuing its remedies under the Resource Management Act, because rather than waiting for Sleepyhead to construct its Sleepyhead estate and then turn up and say that it's going to undertake open cast mining and seek to make commercial arrangements then, we're taking the opportunity now while the proposal is in its infancy to raise these concerns.
Okay, I understand that point. And I think, I'm not sure if you were at the hearing when I declared my sort of interest is the wrong word, but I was heavily involved in the Ohinewai state coal mines investigations and have worked with Mr. Ferguson on a number of proposals in the Waikato when he was at Solid Energy.
Yes.
And I only mention that for the record, not for any other purpose. Any proposal to open cast or underground coal that's held in private ownership as opposed to being Crown owned would require land use consents, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And in determining what's reasonable under Section 85, isn't there some force in Mr. Berry's argument that the prospect of success and the environmental consequences of that reasonable use would assist in making that judgment?
Certainly, sir, but I would suggest that mining operations, particularly in the context of this land, an extensive amount of work has been done to work out ways to carry out open cast mining in this location in a way that addresses those adverse effects.
Well, except we haven't got any evidence of that. Mr. Ferguson specifically says that's beyond his expertise. He said that he's looked at the technical feasibility of getting the coal safely out of the ground, and I certainly accept that evidence, you know, because that's his area of expertise and there's no evidence to the contrary, etc. But he doesn't make any comment whatsoever about the environmental effects other than that he doesn't have the expertise to assess them. And every open cast mine that I can conceive of that's being contemplated at the moment is the subject of huge opposition, not just philosophically, but because in this area, the mining operation involves overburden disposal and all those sorts of things. So surely that's a relevant consideration. And to accept your submission, wouldn't we have to have some knowledge of what those effects were and be satisfied that it was reasonable to assume that that was a likely outcome?
Yes, sir, I accept that you don't have any evidence in front of you about the adverse environmental effects of a mining operation.
Doesn't that come to that?
In the
Doesn't that affect what's reasonable though? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry, you finished.
No, that's all right. I think it does affect what's reasonable. And if the matter went to the Environment Court, we would have to look at whether we got a whole round of expert evidence to assess the adverse environmental effects of a hypothetical mining proposal, but we're simply just not at that stage yet, sir. The public trust administers the Ralph Estates, and we're seeking to protect that interest against a rezoning proposal that would sterilise their interest completely.
I understand that point insofar as it goes.
Yeah.
But I still wonder whether the reasonable test use under Section 85 is not a smokescreen, but is a subservient issue to the claims for compensation that exist under the fact that there's a duality of title.
Yes, so in the absence, I can't take the point on adverse environmental effects.
Yeah, no, I
In
understand
the
that.
absence of an expert.
Okay, no, thank you for that. That's helpful.
Just on that point, though, you're asking us to look at refusing this application, and you got the Section 32 analysis. Don't we need evidence as to the likelihood of you being successful in order to weigh that up as part of our deliberations?
Well, I don't think it's possible to give evidence on whether a resource consent application would be successful, sir. We've given you evidence as to all the work that has been done to prepare a proposal. And the next step would be to lodge a resource consent application. But we're simply not at that stage yet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Mitchell. I'm not sure if it's Mr. Gray or Mr. Ferguson that's going to
Mr.
go
Ferguson
first.
will be next.
Thank you. Morning, Mr. Ferguson.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Morena Commissioners.
Morena.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to my evidence summary. You'll appreciate that some of the comments I've made in my summary have been already covered by Sarah. I won't labour those in the interest of time, but I can obviously expand on points that were raised that need further amplification from a technical or mining point of view. That said, in respect to the rough estate interests at Ohinewai on the wider North Waikato, in fact, the mineral potential of their mineral interests is not fully determined. And I just want to add to the list of potential minerals, which include coal and aggregate and fireclay. There's potential for mineralisation by geothermal fluids, in fact, near Ohinewai. And for example, there are elevated levels of lithium noted on the eastern side of Lake Waikari. And lithium is obviously a significant green mineral, inverted commas. So the minerals have both a historic context vis-a-vis coal and have a future context for emerging technologies. I perhaps could also just proactively address this issue of how compensation to the landowner might work, in particular farmers, because most of the prospect is covered by farmland. In my experience, obviously with Solid Energy, when it was an operating entity, this involved basically negotiating an access arrangement, and it could take several forms. Obviously, purchase would be desirable, but that's also a capital constraint for projects, particularly in the early stages, and that brings commercial risks into play. But let's say there's a scenario where a farmer will agree to access. It's predicated on purchase. Often that land is leased back to the farmer, so he gets the benefit of the capital plus the enjoyment of continuing to operate on his farm. But then there will be trigger points in the mine life, in the mining sequence, which mean that that land has to be consumed as such by the mine for a period of time, and over time it would be rehabilitated. There may be a difference between the pre and post rehabilitation productivity of that land. often the pre-mining productivity is measured and agreed, and then there's further compensation paid in respect to the production potential loss or reduction. So this has been done multiple times throughout Huntly and indeed Rotowaro and in parts of the Maramarua coalfield further north. So Sarah mentioned that the mineral interests under and adjacent the Ohinewai open cut area includes a very substantial quantity of coal. And it's been extensively explored and investigated and assessed over the 40 years that since it was identified and fully drilled out by the New Zealand Coal Resources Survey in the 80s. The quantity of coal in question, there are various estimates of what that might be, and you might wonder why it's not a single point estimate, but that's the nature of the game, unfortunately, that at different stages with different levels of information and different perspectives on some of the variables that go into a resource estimate often generate a range, and the published numbers, or the numbers that are referenced in various technical reports that I've reviewed, indicate somewhere between 17 and 22 million tonnes of coal would be contained in an open cut pit centred on the area around Tahuna Road, and of course the Ambury Properties Limited land sits in the northwestern corner of that potential open cut footprint. The Ralph Estates ownership of that amounts to about 75%. So for that total range, that reduces the Ralph Estates interest to somewhere between 12 and 16 million tonnes, and obviously that's very substantial. The remaining coal resource, the balance, the 25%, is owned by the Crown and other private mineral coal owners. Solid Energy at one stage held a exploration permit over the Crown interests, and my experience is that the other private coal owners are normally more than willing to join, if you like, with any proposal to develop their mineral interests, simply because those opportunities don't come around often. So there's a way of connecting up all the mineral ownership that would make for a complete resource basis for any open cast mine. Whilst this isn't in my summary as such, I think, and I apologise for just introducing this now, but I should note, it's certainly covered in my more detailed evidence, but that the coal is extremely well suited to New Zealand steel, and furthermore, the coal should be regarded as coal for steel making, and we need to consciously distance ourselves from the spectre of thermal coal as such. I think if one follows the political and other rhetoric in the last 1 to 2 years, thermal coal is being phased out as a source of energy, and it's expected that thermal coal would be replaced by renewable energy sources over the next 10 years. Nevertheless, Glenbrook Steel Mill consumes up to 750,000 tonnes of subbituminous coal, otherwise known as, the thermal coal that in former terminology, per annum, 750,000 tonnes per annum. And whilst there are some comments about the viability of New Zealand Steel at the moment, it's expected that given it's operated for the last 50 years, since 1970 when that mill was constructed, it certainly has potential to continue for another 20 plus years, particularly as it has sufficient iron sand resources for that time period to match the availability of coal were the coal mined from Ohinewai. Further to this, existing sources of coal in the North Waikato, currently mined by BT Mining, are probably going to be depleted in the next 10, at best maybe 15 years. And so there's the window of opportunity now to complete feasibility assessment and undertake the work required to inform an assessment of environmental effects and apply for consent and do the land access negotiations that go with that, and obviously deal with the social and cultural issues that need to be traversed in order to, I guess, effectively consult with affected parties in order to give any consent application the maximum possibility of success. I want to say that Ohinewai Opencast is where it's been assessed economically by Solid Energy as recently as 2015-2016. The net present value, using a range of assumptions admittedly, but first principles derived operating costs, capital estimates for infrastructure and pre-stripping and the like, and of course land, and some relatively conservative market revenues or prices per tonne show a positive NPV anywhere between 10 and up to $175 million. My take on that is that the 10 million NPV scenario would not pass muster, but the revenues that drive the higher NPVs would have to be locked in, obviously, with a market contract, and then the mine. The feasibility assessment could be completed on that basis, the economics at least. The estimates are in the conceptual to pre-feasibility level of accuracy, indicating margins of error or accuracy of 30, perhaps up to 50%. But given the large net present value, increases in costs or reductions in market value could be absorbed by the project, and it would still be highly positive.
I think, Mr. Ferguson, we're very keen. We've read your evidence and we've read your summary. We're very keen to get to the pointy end of what it is specifically about the proposal that adversely affects the Ralph Estates interests.
Okay.
So I don't want to move you on unnecessarily, but I think it would be helpful to. No, and again, we're going over ground, but we are aware of that and that we have read in some detail.
Yeah. Okay. Well. And in light of that, then effectively, if you can imagine the and images in my detailed evidence show the extent of the proposed opencast mine, and if you like, imagine Tahuna Road splits it into a northern and southern sector, just as a rough frame of reference, and the Embry Properties Limited rezoning is on the northern side of Tahuna Road.
Yes.
Now, the presence of the industrial estate, the commercial development there, the housing, the rezoning that drives that effectively would prevent or make extremely onerous the ability to pursue and mine coal north of the road. And in fact, that would sterilise, and I need to explain perhaps for the other commissioners what that term means. It seems to be unique to the coal mining industry, but sterilise means render unmineable in a sense. Okay, so the APL, the Embry Properties Limited Development or rezoning, sterilises, by my estimate, approximately 9 million tonnes, and by a more first principles based estimate by Mr. Gray, who will talk next, I imagine, something like 7.5 million tonnes. And that is it in a nutshell. That is the effect that we're trying to disclose here, highlight, and navigate in some way that would result in a satisfactory outcome for the mineral owner. being the Ralph Estates. And given your request for me to be to cut to the chase, I guess I think that statement does it. But I do have some comments on some of the technical evidence presented by Mr. Lyons previously, if I may.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Just talk to that. I'm just trying to pick the eyes out of this. One of the comments that Mr. Lyons made was that the Waikato Northhead mine, which mines the iron sands that feed the Glenbrook steel mill, iron sands are component one of a two-component mix, coal being the other. They are merged in a very unique process, a globally unique process at Glenbrook Steel Mill to make steel. And Mr. Lyons suggested that the mine life was something like 10 to 20 years. Now, he doesn't provide any basis for that, but I will say that in terms of anticipating mine life, life of mine plans are subject to ever-changing inputs, assumptions, and business strategies, and therefore I'd suggest that 20 years is probably as far out as any business can reasonably anticipate. But I will go back to a point I perhaps made earlier, which is that New Zealand Steel and some of its predecessors, the likes of BHP, etc., have successfully operated Waikato Northhead and the mill in combination with the Huntly sourced coal for 50 years. Okay, and it's been in that time through a number of challenges about viability, etc. So to me, there is an ongoing market, and I think it could stretch decades beyond 20 years from now. The iron sand resources are there. There's essentially hundreds of millions of tonnes of iron sand in and around Waikato Northhead. I won't go into the detail associated with that. Mr. Lyons and others like Mr. Spate and Mr. Stafford referred to several environmental issues associated with forming stable pit slopes and the effects of dewatering and settlement of the land, dewatering affecting the shallow lakes Ohinewai and Rotokawa, and possibly Lake Waikato. On that front, I'd like to point out that there is precedent for developing deep open cast mines adjacent some of the shallow Waikato lakes, and the prime case in point would be Lake Weavers, and you've declared you have history there. You know, here we have a pit that was probably in the order of 80 to 100 metres deep, formed immediately adjacent Lake Wahi. Successfully without incident, and it was mined, and it was rehabilitated, then flooded without incident, and now has created a community amenity asset. There's another nearby example being Kimihia open cast next to the Lake Kimihia, which is much closer to Ohinewai, admittedly off to one side of the Huntly coalfield, but proves the same point that deep open cast mines can be developed adjacent to these shallow Waikato lakes. With respect to Ohinewai and Rotokawa, and noting the comments about, I think it was from Mr. Stafford, that these are clean lakes, meaning they don't have a mud layer at the base of the lake that prevents water transmission, and effectively expressions of artesian water pressure, groundwater pressure. There are strategies that could be deployed to mitigate the effects of developing the pit that would then see a drawdown of the groundwater in and around those lakes. I won't go into detail here. It's on the fringe of my expertise, obviously, but some of the strategies, in fact, were listed by, I think it was Mr. Stafford in paragraph 14 of his summary evidence. But what are we talking about? Sheet pile walls, slurry walls, grout curtains, and the like. What I'm saying basically is that those lakes could be either isolated by flow barriers, or maybe not flow barriers, but also by controlled water transmission, and basically recharged with water to maintain their current state. So that's those are some examples of how some of the significant effects that have been foreseen could be mitigated. I'd also like to comment that I've managed several feasibility studies for open cut coal mine projects in the Waikato, and as part of that, the AEE, or the environmental effects assessments, which support consenting. I've been, or at least Cameron Lyons indicated that my view of feasibility was somewhat narrow because it didn't take account of the ability to consent. Well, that's to some extent correct. I have focused on the technical feasibility aspects, being the ability to dewater the overburden materials and handle them, excavate them productively and in a cost-effective manner, and to place them off to the southeast and stack them as an external overburden storage area. Now, the wider environmental effects, which I've deliberately avoided it as such, would be the subject of further detailed assessment. That's clear, and the project assessment was stalled at essentially due to the demise of Solid Energy, having done a limited amount of assessment of the groundwater system. Further effects across the gamut of emissions, biology, cultural effects, social effects, rehabilitation, all of those things are obviously specialist areas that would require a significant body of work. But the time frame between now and when other resources, as I say, mined in the North Waikato currently for the next 10 to 15 years, that's the time frame to do that work. And that was sort of alluded to in my in the information memorandum attached to my detailed evidence. So it's clear there are some high risks that need to be resolved prior to the project more generally to be considered feasible. A market would need to be market arrangements would need to be agreed. Some of the land access arrangements need to be sorted out, and obviously this issue of social acceptance would need to be worked through as part of the AEE prior to any consent application. Mr. Lyons also made comment about the assumed setback that Gary and I adopted in determining the quantity of coal that would be affected by not being able to develop north of Tahuna Road. I'd just say that I caution against speculating on the extent of the setback and the implied slope performance risk. The final setback which we adopted was 100 metres, in my opinion, was appropriate to safeguard use of a public road, particularly given the nature of the overburden materials forming the slope to the south of it. There are quantitative risk assessment techniques which can look at that risk in some detail, and I'm confident that that the setback would be, quantitatively determined and would appropriately reflect the risks. So I hope that somewhat checkered overview of my evidence is helpful, and obviously I'm more than happy to address questions that you may wish to raise.
Thanks, Mr. Ferguson. Let's just see if there are any questions. Mr. Fulton?
No, Mr. Ferguson, thank you very much. No, I don't have any questions.
Mr. Mark?
Yeah, kia ora, Mr. Ferguson, and just recognising that you've stated that no AE has been done at this point, and obviously it would be something that would be required in time to assess the environmental effects this type of proposition may have. Are you able to inform us whether locally or nationally, when was the last open cast mine consented?
Thank you, Mr. Mark. The last one would have been the escarpment mine on the Denniston Plateau, West Coast. open cast coal mine I'm talking about.
Yes. How many years
That would have been in the order of, I can't give you a precise date, but certainly in the last 10 years, in the last 5 to 10 years, I'd suggest. And it was arduous, I guess. I think Rangatira Developments, in conjunction with Stevenson Mining, were attempted to consent to Kuha, just northwest of northeast of Westport, but that was declined due to a conflict in I think the Reserves Act relative to the footprint of the mine. Prior to that, we would have to go to possibly a mine in Reefton, if not Kopako open cast at Maramarua, which was consenting outside of a coal mining licence, therefore had to get the full gamut of resource consent, that is district and regional consents. So in the last 10 years, there are several examples where coal mines have been successfully consented. That's not to understate the effort involved, and technically in terms of the some of the broader social issues that these projects bring up, and of course the cost.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mate. Mr. Kearney?
Yes, you say that the possible development of this mine may be able to, the coal may be used to service New Zealand Steel. Have you talked to New Zealand Steel about that?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Ferguson. I don't have any questions. Thanks. Your point of view and your evidence is pretty clear, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Mitchell.
Yes, Mr. Gray will address you now.
Thank you. Mr. Gray, just to, and I should have said this earlier, just because I don't think you've been at the hearing for its duration. We have read your evidence. We have read your summary. There's no need to take us through the detail of that verbatim because we're aware of what you've said. We're really looking for you to present a highlights package to us of the issues that are of concern to you, and drawing out the key aspects of your evidence and or summary that you'd like us to be particularly aware of. So I'll just make that point before we kick off. Oh, there you are. So we're in your hands. Thank you, Mr. Gray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and other commissioners. Thank you for your time. So my involvement in this project really has been just to look at and provide an estimate of the value of coal which would be sterilised by the rezoning. I think Mr. Ferguson covered a lot of things and described how that will happen. Well, I will just recap a little bit, because one of the things which I find so important is the fact that the Ralph estate has for over 150 years derived an income from their mineral estates being mined. And even at the moment in Huntly, the mines which are occurring there, surface mines are all mining coal which even 10 years ago could not have been mined because of the change in technologies. I acknowledge the issues of the groundwater and settlements which would occur around a surface mine. But from my point, I'm a mining engineer, and my job is usually just how do we make this work rather than it can't be done. So that's, and there's technically nothing that can't be done. So in the process of undertaking my work here, I based it using on the work which Solid Energy undertook in 2015, finishing up there, in which they, based on hundreds of drill holes, and I know they've done a lot of water modelling and geotech work, and I rebuilt the geology model which they had produced themselves from this drill data. So I'm pretty confident in the numbers in terms of the tonnages of coal. I reproduced the open pit design which Solid Energy had revised from previous designs. It wasn't the big 35 million tonne pit that mined out all of the lakes. It actually left buffers around the lakes and is quite restricted. So in terms of that, is conservative, unlike back in the 1980s when you would have been looking at bucket wheels and huge machinery. And essentially taking account of the pit slope angles, which effectively, the bottom line of it is that around 7.5 million tonnes of Ralph Estate coal would not be able to be mined if the rezoning goes ahead, because that's what it would cause. Without, we would not.
It's valued at between 4.2 and $7 million in your assessment.
Yes. So as regards to value, the actual value of the coal will be around about $1 billion. So, and Ralph Estate. So I use the Bellman Code as a method for evaluating mineral resources, and it's recognised around the world, and especially New Zealand and Australia. Predominantly, Ralph Estate has derived its income historically from being paid a royalty for the coal as it's mined. That is the case now, as has been for a long time, and that gives I've got a range of values. So I looked at a range of values through comparisons on the market, amount of money costs which have been expended to date so far, which although Ralph Estate themselves do not spend the money, but the benefits of those have been accrued by Ralph Estate. When Solid Energy, for instance, in 2008, when they began this work last time, they paid Ralph Estates $2 million for the option to explore and mine. So as recently as 2008, it was worth $2 million just for someone to have a look and have the option to mine it. So there's definitely value there in the coal. And so the range of values typical in mining is looking at Ralph Estate, they either would earn money from their royalties or these other values, which came to a range of between roughly $4 and $7 million was the range of values.
Yeah, I think we understand that point.
Yep. So that's it in a nutshell on the bottom line, really.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Gray. Mr. Marg, do you have any questions?
Just a point of clarity, Mr. Gray. You talk about the Ralph Estate taking receiving a royalty from Solid Energy of $2 million, and at the same time you say they've been mining for the last 100, or deriving an income from mining for the last 100. Are they were they an actual mining company, or are they simply just an estate that's received royalties?
In current times, they're an estate that receives royalties, but the Ralph Mining Company used to have a shaft sunk in the main street of Huntley.
Rightio.
Back in the 1800s. Yeah. So originally they were miners, and then the rights have passed on. So, I mean, even as of today, the miner Awaroa in Rotowara. So that's mining Ralph Estate coal. So they're paying royalty right now for the Ralph Estate coal that they're mining also.
Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just one question. The figures that you have given us and the values that you have expressed,
Yes.
I would expect that this would form a compensatory dollar value should you negotiate with the Comfort Group. Is that the way you deal with it?
I think that this is what the coal that's being lost would be valued at, yes. So it could be used as a basis for that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fulton. Mr. Kearney?
No, thank you. Thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Gray. That's
Mr. Mitchell?
pretty clear. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. There's nothing you want to address that's arisen during the presentation from the two witnesses?
No, that's everything, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Which brings us to Mr. McLaughlin from Ohinewai Lands, please.
Hello, sir. Mr. Hutchings here. I'm Councillor for Ohinewai.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Hutchings, my mistake. Sorry.
That's okay, but I have Mr. McLaughlin here with me, who will be able to go through a summary of his submission, his evidence, and answer any questions that you have as well. So I'll just take you briefly through the key points of my submissions. To start with, Ohinewai Lands Limited, you'll be aware they have numerous land holdings in the Ohinewai area. The key ones in relation to this are to the north and south of the Ambury Properties development. As set out in the evidence of Mr. McLaughlin and the submissions, that OLL is not seeking to rezone its land holdings through this process. It's seeking merely to not have development precluded in the future, and there's kind of three main aspects that it seeks there, and that's through access to its land, the Tahuna Road frontage, and the structure plan itself. Now, OLL's always been interested in sensible development at Ohinewai and has sought a structure planning exercise to be undertaken for the whole wider area, and it's kind of been refined as we've gone along to those north and south sites, and particularly as the findings of Waikato 2070 have come out. So just turning to part two of the submissions, the relief sought. Going through those three things, so the access to the land holdings, the access to the northern part of the northern land, to the north of APLs, is identified on the master plan of APL that was presented in the evidence of Mr. Oliver, and we are submitting that should be transferred over and identified on the structure plan itself. We note that Ms. Trinath has acknowledged that that's a good idea as well, and would just like to have that noted. To the south, access is via the roundabout that's currently detailed on the structure plan, but Mr. Jones has identified that it would be helpful to have the further eastern access reinstated on that structure plan, not from an OLL perspective, but to avoid a cul-de-sac forming within the residential land. And we just like to submit that from that perspective we would agree, and also it would help the cohesivity between the OLL development and the APL development itself. In respect to the Tahuna Road frontage, there's been a number of provisions put forward by APL, but I've noted throughout the hearing that that seems to be a bit of a moving feast, and there is a discussion of creating a Ohinewai chapter. So therefore I'm not going to go into detail over what we've submitted in terms of the provisions, but I would just like to note that we would like to be involved in have comment on any drafting of that chapter going forward in the future to ensure that our relief is not precluded. The frontage itself, we've received technical advice that was submitted as part of the 32A report that the setback should not exist, that it's better to not have development, not have houses turning their back per se on the front, on the Tahuna Road on both sides. Yeah, so while we accept that if that isn't the case, the provisions need to preclude that from happening. The structure plan itself, I've touched on the connections there, but in terms of the identification of the OL land as a future growth area, there's two kind of thoughts around this. One, the fact that there is a structure plan that exists in respect to the APL development. We'd like to be identified that northern land and the southern land as future growth area, but we're also aware that the council is currently under discussions about how to note and identify the findings of the Waikato 2070 in terms of these future areas throughout the district. And while nothing we understand has been landed on yet, this might be something that's addressed in the rezoning hearings that's coming up. So OLL's submission is that if that is the case and there is some form of deferred zone or overlay on a district-wide level that's proposed as part of that hearing that could be considered for our land holdings as well. And that the two-pronged approach of having that in the planning maps as well as on the structure plan would be preferred by OLL. Turning to the Section 32A report that was filed, there's 3 reports filed with that: urban design, infrastructure and archaeological assessment. As mentioned, the urban design report concluded that more or less symmetrically fronting both sides of Tahuna Road will establish a stronger eastern entry into the expanded Ohinewai settlement and better support reduced travel speeds. And it's important that future development does not turn its back on Tahuna Road and that linear one-sided ribbon development is avoided. The infrastructure report concluded that from a flood perspective, there's no issues and that an option is to fill the floodplain and offset. Now we note that in APL's assessment and as acknowledged by Mercury Energy that displacement from infill from the APL proposal is likely to have an insignificant effect, while future investigations will have to occur in the future on OL land where that's potentially an option there, given that less displacement will be required because of the topography of OL land. Moving forward, since the 32A report was submitted, the National Policy on Urban Development has come out, and I know this has been traversed in great detail over the last couple of days, but my thoughts on it that it's indicated a very significant policy shift to allow growth out as well as up through that policy 8, which has been discussed in detail. That policy 8 should be taken into account when assessing the alternative land release provisions in the RPS, and that the findings in Waikato 2070 should also be used to help make that assessment, as it's sort of the latest findings of growth strategy in the district. So yeah, just paragraph 4.8. The Waikato Regional Policy Statement is required to be amended by the NPSUD. It will also need to be amended to reflect the future-proof Phase 2 review. So the review of the RPS will follow the decisions on any APL rezoning request and will likely precede consideration of any rezoning on the future plan change or consent proposal in respect of the OL land holdings. So any alternative land release provisions that are still in place will need to be considered in detail at that time. So that's just detailing that we haven't undertaken that assessment at the moment because we're not seeking the rezoning, and that assessment will be undertaken in the future based on any of those new provisions that come out of the future-proof Phase 2 review. Turning now to Waikato 2070. This is a document that is intended to inform how, where and when growth occurs in the district over the next 50 years. Stakes that will ultimately inform the long-term planning and therefore affect the social, cultural and economic and environmental well-being. Since the 32A report was submitted on OL, this has been firmed up and has been amended to include the OL land to the south as future residential and the OL land to the north as industrial. We submit that this document is very important in the district and should be given reasonably significant weight in your considerations. It's the most up-to-date document and reflects what is occurring in the district today with a more accurate revision in the future, particularly as future-proof is undergoing further review and its findings are uncertain at this point. So OL has placed significant weight on the 2070 strategy and its decision-making for its land holdings. Due to the long-term nature of OL's aspirations for its land, it's sought to try and do this in a more sensible order and do what it can through the proposed district plan process, but also try and get the strategy documents sorted out. And so that's why a significant effort was put into Waikato 2070 and will be put into any future-proof review going forward this year when comments are allowed to be made. In terms of the Section 42A report, I've kind of gone through the main changes on that, but I would just like to note, in terms of the WRFPS and future-proof, that OL's position is that if the APL proposal is accepted, then there is merit in future-proofing growth at Ohinewai to potentially enable the OL site to be developed in the future, if and when it requires it. Decisions made now could preclude that possibility. This does not constitute land release inconsistent with agreed settlement patterns. It is simply sensible planning. Recognising the strategy adopted by Waikato 2070 indicates development unanticipated by the WRPS and uncertainty regarding future growth within the river communities due to growth propositions being considered for the Hamilton to Auckland corridor plan. In respect to infrastructure, Mr. McLaughlin will talk to this further, but OL has been in communications with Watercare in terms of the Mid-Waikato servicing strategy to ensure that its land is considered within that strategy, and it has been, because it's been based on the Waikato 2070 findings. But we'd just like to make the point that the strategy has identified issues of non-compliance within the existing infrastructure in Huntly. So the greater development in Ohinewai will ensure that more funding is available to not only provide capacity for the growth, but also allow the necessary upgrades to existing infrastructure to occur without having to fall solely on the existing ratepayers, which is a lot smaller base. So to sum up, OLL isn't seeking a standalone development in itself. It has the longer term aspirations that are aimed to complement the APL development through larger lot sizes, different topography. It sits higher than the APL land, therefore offering a different view. And it's also well connected to the open space surrounding it in terms of Lake Ohinewai and Ohinewai Reserve, and would add, and Mr. McLaughlin will talk to the further, add another sort of string to the bow of the APL development, providing people options in terms of the different types of housing they would like to have. So to conclude, OL is not seeking rezoning of its land, but recognition of its land holdings in the future growth areas to the extent that it aligns with the Waikato 2070 strategy. OL supports the proposal of APL with the amendments and provisions and the structure plan set out in section 2. I can answer any questions now.
Mr. Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Hutchins, but no questions from me, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
I just got one, Mr. Hutchins. I just wanted to clarify, you interpolated and said that Ms. Trenouf supported your submission about the amending the structure plan to recognise the future potential of the APL, the Ohinewai lands holdings. Just going back and checking while you were talking to what she did say, I'm not sure that she went as far as that. I think what she did say is that she didn't see that the structure plan should be amended in the way that you're suggesting, e.g. some annotation of future development. I think she was telling us that she thought that it made sense to design the roundabout, which is the second part of the relief that your client is seeking. And she can clarify that in due course. But what's your understanding of that? Yes,
sorry, I probably didn't make myself.
And it may be that I misinterpreted what you said as well.
It was in terms of the master plan, number 15 has 2 indicative.
That's what she, that's your understanding of as far as what she has supported. She hasn't gone as far as to say that your client's land should have some annotation attached to it by way of calling it future urban zone or something. I don't think she's gone that far, has she?
No, that's correct. No, she hasn't.
Okay, no, that's fine. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, it was merely future, and merely in terms of the access points to the north.
The second question that I have is that you've elected not to call any evidence in support of the planning assessment and the other assessments that have been undertaken and the Section 32A report that's been filed as technical information. how, given, and coming back not so much to the design of the intersection, but the future urban zoning, given that the only evidence that we're going to hear on that is from Mr. McLaughlin, and he's acknowledged that he's just providing an overview of their interests and what they're seeking to achieve, as opposed to being expert evidence in the traditional sense, how much weight can we give to those documents that are on the record, but we haven't had the opportunity to test by way of questioning of witnesses and so forth?
So I think in terms of the relief that OL is seeking, we are of the opinion that there's enough information in front of you to make that decision. I mean, we're not seeking a rezoning. We're merely seeking to not have rezoning precluded and kind of have the structure plan reflect what's been said in Waikato 2070. So it's not to say that the zoning will go ahead. It's merely to provide an indication to the landowners and infrastructure providers that there's potential there in the future.
What's the evidential basis for us being able to do that, though? Other than some technical reports that have been filed that are on the record, but that we haven't been able to ask questions of anybody about the assumptions made, the conclusions drawn. And noting that Ms. Trenoth, as I understand it, doesn't support that proposition.
I guess, so the way, that is the difficulty, is that you haven't been able to ask questions of the witnesses, and OL has made, I guess, a strategic decision in terms of resourcing for this in that respect. But I think the 32A analysis is reasonably robust and sets out the costs and benefits of this and comes to those conclusions. So while I respect that you don't get to have those witnesses in front of you, I think in terms of the relief that OL is seeking, it is enough to.
But if you're talking about not precluding future rezoning, as the owner of the land, isn't that entirely in your hands? It's farmland at the moment, as I understand it, held in a number of titles, and it's an extensive land holding. Isn't the simple solution to that to wait for 2070 to unfold, not sell that land off and whatever else might happen, and just keep farming it? That doesn't preclude its future rezoning, does it?
No, it doesn't, sir. And that's exactly right. But it's sort of, well, and that's been the strategy of OL through working on those strategic documents in terms of 2070 and future-proof going forward. But there is an opportunity presented here to work with APL, and there has been discussions going on about how both developments can benefit each other, and Mr. McLaughlin can go into this further in terms of sharing of earthworks. And
yeah, I just wonder, I don't want to express a view because we haven't heard from Mr. McLaughlin yet, but I just wonder if you're putting the cart before the horse somewhat, in that there are a bunch of strategic documents that are being worked through. And you might say the strategic decision has been, there's an opportunity now, but there's also a process to be gone through where these sorts of proposals would be given the sort of consideration that the Ambury one is at this hearing. And I just put to you that maybe this is an opportunity to also jump the gun as opposed to take an opportunity that's available to you.
Our intention wasn't so much to jump the gun, more that there's been a strategic document in Waikato 2070 release that indicates that, you know, this area is has potential for development in the future, and I guess OL just wants that recognised in the plan itself, and whether the council comes up with a method through that, or the fact that there is a wider structure planning exercise going on at the moment. It seems a shame to not have that sort of development indicated within that structure plan to help.
But in RMA terms, it's a circular argument, because 2070 is not a statutory document in RMA terms. It's relevant. Yes. And Mr. Oliver's made extensive reference to it insofar as it relates to his client's proposal. But you haven't, and we haven't got any evidence in front of us on that basis either. And there's a process to be played out in terms of 2070 in the Broad, because otherwise we'd be taking your argument, everything that 2070 proposes in a plan that's got a life of 10 years, we'd be identifying, you know, half the Waikato district as future urban. And that surely can't make sense.
I guess within the context of this, there is a live rezoning proposal in front of you that is right next to the OLL land. So it's not as fanciful as, say, other land that might be rezoned sort of randomly in the future. That, yeah, that's as far as I can.
Okay, I understand the point. I don't think I can take it any further, but thank you for your answers.
Just on that point, what are you actually seeking? Are you seeking a notation on the planning maps or the structure plan? What are you actually seeking by way of relief?
We're seeking, in the first instance, a notation on the structure plan itself.
And what does that notation? What's it supposed to say?
Future growth area, or something along the lines of what's identified in Waikato 2070. So yeah, growth area or future residential or future industrial, or something along those lines that marries up with that document. There's currently, as I sort of alluded to before, there's nothing within the wider plan itself in terms of future growth areas, but I do understand that the council is thinking about that in the Waikato 2070 context, and that might be something that has to be addressed in other hearings down the track.
So it's similar to putting future residential or future growth area, is that which you put on plans? But that's what you're trying to seek, is it? Future development area.
Along those lines, yes, but in the first instance, just on the structure plan. So I guess it doesn't probably have as much weight as on the planning map. It's more to provide that indication and allow for the wider sort of structure plan and future infrastructure provision within the Ohinewai area to just note to people and landholders that this land is and may be developed in the future, just so that it's not dismissed. And it kind of goes to I know there's been a few concerns raised about cumulative effects, and these assessments all kind of been piecemeally kind of taking chunks of the pie as they come up, and that's what this is sort of trying to avoid a little bit, is say, well, why not think about the big picture now and identify these potential areas, as opposed to dealing with it all like down the track at different stages. It's
a big somersault, though, isn't it, to have the Sleepyhead proposal with all the evidence that's provided, and you haven't provided any evidence, and you want us to put on the planning maps, oh, this is okay, this is appropriate land to be rezoned for future development. And it's the point the chairman has just mentioned. We've got no evidence, have we?
It's not so much that you're saying this land ticks all the boxes for development. It's just saying that this land may be developed in the future and has been indicated on structure planning documents as potentially being appropriate.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Hutchings.
So I'll get Mr. McLaughlin now to provide a summary of his evidence and then answer any questions for you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Mr. McLaughlin.
Just.
Sorry. Yeah, it is still good morning, just.
Yeah. Yes, my name's Tony McLaughlin, and I've been engaged by OLL as a development advisor. I've over 30 years experience in property development, investment and management, predominantly in the Waikato, and I've worked with the Peacock family on other developments in recent times, including Rangatahi and Ragland. As a significant long-term land owner at Ohinewai, OLL supports the development of industrial and commercial and residential activities at Ohinewai as envisaged by Waikato 2070 growth strategy. As Mr. Hutchings has outlined, we're not seeking a rezoning under the proposed district plan, although we have actively participated in Waikato 2070. We've also had discussions with Watercare regarding the Waikato, Mid-Waikato servicing strategy, and intend to participate in phase 2 of the future-proof growth strategy, and monitoring information and opportunities related to the Hamilton to Auckland corridor plan. OLL believes that encouraging growth of the Mid-Waikato in locations such as Ohinewai will be beneficial not only to ensuring the delivery of infrastructure upgrades to address existing non-compliance issues, but also to the regeneration of existing settlements. We certainly see this as a far better and more sustainable alternative than some of the other options for creating a large number of jobs in the area, like coal mining. Development of Ohinewai is consistent with Waikato 2070 growth strategy, has been provided for in the Mid-Waikato servicing strategy. Without development in Ohinewai, the costs of delivering the Mid-Waikato servicing strategy would need to be spread over far fewer households and businesses, increasing the risk that many of these projects may either not happen or will be significantly delayed. The development of Ohinewai's land is complementary to the development of Amberley's properties land, and therefore we've already had discussions between the parties regarding how we may be able to work together to repair our respective sites for development, including the use of fill from OLL's land by Amberley. So that's those are ongoing discussions, but there certainly seems to be good alignment there. In terms of our residential development, we're looking at more conventional residential development on our lots to the south of Tahuna Road versus Amberley's more medium density development. So we're looking at providing a range of housing options at Ohinewai in the foreseeable future. In terms of the issues that Mr. Hutchings has covered, access, the Tahuna Road interface, and the structure plan, I don't think I need to cover those in any more detail, other than that I guess we're looking for a structure planning process that gives OLL some encouragement that we can invest further in unlocking this opportunity. And in my experience, that's really what's needed in some of these large greenfields developments, is to encourage developers with financial will and capability to take the next step and to help relieve council of the burden of infrastructure in its entirety, and leading that infrastructure investment. You get a far better outcome in my experience when you have developers actively engaged in that process. They're willing to invest in infrastructure ahead of perhaps when council may otherwise invest in infrastructure, and then that gets the development off the ground far more quickly. And obviously Amberley are doing that here, but OLL has the opportunity and capability to do that as well with the appropriate encouragement. And I guess that's some of the discussion you've been having with Mr. Hutchings around, is why are we not seeking a rezoning, and why are we looking to just not preclude the rezoning in the future? And that's really the crux of this comes down to for me is infrastructure, and being able to fund that infrastructure to unlock this area. So that's where the structure planning process is key to that, and that will address things like the access between the APL sites and the OLL sites. It also deals with the issues around Tahuna Road. So having a good structure planning process in support of the rezoning is something we think is very important to getting the right outcomes. Will also allow key local assets like the reserve area, which sit outside the APL site, but which are key amenities for the area, to be integrated into that, and ensure that they are considered when APL and OLL are developing their sites in the future. So in conclusion, OLL supports development of APL's site for industrial, commercial and residential land uses to the extent that it accords with the vision of Waikato 2070. We believe OLL's proposed future development is complementary to the development of APL's site, and would like to see a comprehensive and integrated structure planning process completed for the wider Ohinewai area, not just the APL site. And we seek that the provisions of the proposed Waikato District Plan do not preclude the growth options identified at Ohinewai and Waikato 2070. including the future rezoning of OLL's land. Getting my tongue to it. So that's all from me. I'm happy to answer some questions around any of the engagement we've had with APL and things like that.
Thanks, Mr. McLaughlin. That was helpful, and it was succinct and got to the point. So we appreciate that too. Mr. Fulton, do you have any questions?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Mr. Marg?
None from me, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Thank you.
No, I don't think I have any questions either. Thanks, Mr. McLaughlin. Your evidence is clear, and you've explained your situation clearly, and I've asked Mr. Hutchings the sorts of questions that have been occurring to me, so I don't think there's any need to ask you those same questions, but thank you very much for your evidence.
No problems, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hutchings.
Mr. Chairman, Simon Berry, just while we're getting the next party on, I just wanted to signal that my instructions are to reply today, if that's still, you're amenable to that, with doing the written reply next week once we have all of the inputs from our experts.
All right, thanks. That's noted, Mr. Berry. We'll just, from our point of view, just have that conversation again with you when we get to the end of today, whenever that happens to be. What I'm going to suggest right at this minute is that we just take it. We can either take the lunch break early, which I'm loath to do, or we can take a 2-minute to stretch our legs adjournment briefly, and I think I'm more in favour of the former than the latter. So unless there's any violent objection, I'm just proposing that we take a 2-minute adjournment to get a breath of fresh air and do whatever else is associated with that, and then come back in a moment.
Bye-bye.
Including myself. All right, thanks everyone. I think we're ready to resume. Is Ms. Ma online at the moment? I'm not sure that she is. Is Mr. White still there? I don't think he's there either, so he can't help us. Mr. Bell, do you have any, or anyone, any of the council team have any knowledge about what Ms. Ma's intentions are?
I haven't heard anything elsewise from Catherine, Miss Mayher, about it. She said she was going to attend. Yesterday she did note she was working and had some workshops to attend to, but I'm not unsure if they were going to carry over to today.
Okay. All right, well, we'll...
I can give her a ring, but we can carry on with the batting order.
No, I think we just need to proceed. That's fine. Mr. Donald, I think Mr. Donald is there. I think I can see his name on my screen. I can indeed, now I can see him. Good afternoon, Mr. Donald.
Afternoon, sir. Oh, kia ora
Ready,
koutou.
thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Gavin Donald tōku ingoa. I'm here on behalf of Waikato Tainui today. With me is Marae Tukiri, General Manager of Development and Wellbeing.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
So you've obviously received my summary
Yes.
of evidence.
Yes, thank you.
I'm not proposing to deviate from that to any great extent as a result of what I've heard over the last couple of days. And it may be quite similar. Maybe there's some discussion towards the end around potential wastewater solutions, but I figure that will come through in questioning. So I'll just progress through the submission if that's okay with you.
Certainly, thank you.
So Waikato Tainui was one of the original further submitters to the APL submission. This further submission was in opposition to the proposed zoning change, as very little information was provided, and it was essentially a concept, and we had very little to consider or review. Since this further submission, Waikato Tainui has continued to be engaged with the proposal, and its issues with the proposal have evolved to the point where some concerns have essentially been or completely resolved. This is largely because of the additional work that APL had undertaken, the inputs of the Tangata Whenua Working Group, and the expert conferencing that the hearing panel facilitated. From a broad range of concerns to today, where we are limiting our presentation to the provision of drinking water and the development of wastewater infrastructure. So as you'll see in the presentation summary, the outstanding concerns for Waikato Tainui are limited to the water discussion. These can basically be grouped, or there's three key points for us. Stage 2 of the development and how the Huntly wastewater treatment plant can accommodate the additional discharge within its quality consent limits. I mean, we're all very aware of the failings at the Huntly wastewater treatment plant, the 4 or 5 years of poor performance. So that's a key area for us for discussion. Stage 3 of development and how the Huntly wastewater treatment plant, as yet undefined wastewater treatment solution, can accommodate the additional discharge, given the current resource consent expires this decade. And then finally, which potentially isn't quite as significant as the wastewater concerns, but the availability of water for the site, in particular the status of third-party agreements and the reliance on them to adequately provide water for the site. There's been discussion in the conferencing around the shortfall that occurs in the future with the supply to Ngārawahia. So we are really looking to unpick or understand the water take issue, given that the development's not the only one that seems to be seeking water from the Waikato River at the moment. It's fairly highly publicised that everybody wants some. So we would like to understand a little bit more how APL are actually going to deliver water. And really those are our three high-level points, Mr. Chair. And I will just remind, and I know you'll have read it in most of my submissions, when all of my submissions here, that Waikato Tainui, when they attend these hearings, we are simply guided by what is best for river. This principle is communicated through Te Ture Whaimana, through Taitumu Tau Paritau, and it really is the basis for everything that we submit to you today. So we will keep that at forefront of mind and happy to ask any questions, and Ms. Turkey is here as well.
Thank you, Mr. Donald. That's succinct, and we certainly understand the points that are being made. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Fulton?
No, Mr. Donald, I take it that, Tainui's position is that you're not opposed to the APL concept. It's really the protection of the waters and the rivers and your other things that you just talked about. Is that really what it's all about? It's trying to be helpful, but not really trying to oppose it?
Absolutely, sir. I mean, if we had certain things aligned, our opposition would be gone. But we come back to the awa and what's best for river, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Mark?
Yeah, kia ora, Mr. Donald, and how are you, marae? No questions from me, but like what Mr. Fulton just clarified. Ka pai. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mark. Mr. Cooney?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Donald, for for the position that Waikato Tainui has taken, and your evidence as well. It's very clear. Although I just want to tease out a little bit from you. What you're doing is sending a very big signal, a big red light to the developer, and probably WDC. You better get your wastewater stuff right, otherwise we're coming in and we're going to oppose any types of renewals and things like that. Is that sort of I know I'm generalising, but that's the sort of position?
I'm not sure I would make it so targeted at this council, but we are in a vision and strategy environment in the Waikato region, and people need to up their game, really.
Yes.
Yeah. So you don't object in principle to this rezoning proposal, but your position is is qualified by, well, you better get these things right because we're keeping an eye on you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Can I just take that one step further, Mr. Donald, and go to the summary of your actual written evidence as opposed to the summary, where you say, I'm of the opinion that potential, this is paragraph 7.3, I'm of the opinion that potential exists for the development to occur should APL and the District Council provide actual water and wastewater solutions for the site. As of yet, this has not been presented and will continue to be the key issue for approving the APL rezoning request. Could you just explain to me, I mean, that's conditional support, if you like, or conditional not support, depending on where that point ends up. But are you able to conceive of a solution to that problem that we can address as part of our deliberations that would enable that concern about APL and the District Council coming to some meeting of the minds, as it were, about the way forward? Because they haven't yet. I mean, there is a memorandum of understanding and all those sorts of things. So there's an intent, but there's no line in the sand as yet. Can you offer us a potential solution to this?
Well, absolutely, sir. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, we've had that conversation amongst representatives of Waikato Tainui, and there is potential to remove the opposition towards the wastewater component. We're in other forums where councils are facing challenges to deliver wastewater. We don't pretend that it's a cheap or easy undertaking. Absolutely understand that, sir. We are working, we as in Waikato Tainui, with other river iwi to address a very similar situation in the region, where there's a short-term component and then a long-term component. The short, and in this situation, I feel is almost, it's not identical, but it's similar, sir. We are engaged with and have delivered, call it an MOU, a written confirmation, whatever you want to call it, but there is a commitment from this authority as to what quality wastewater they will deliver in their long-term consent. They haven't designed their treatment plant yet, but they have committed to the minimum standards, which are a lot better than what they are delivering now. They've committed to that, and that's with multiple river iwi. I would have thought it was actually a more complex situation than what we have in front of us today. And that's a solution that I still think could be rolled out here. I mean, I know you've got limited time into when you're making a decision on this, sir, but there's enough smart engineers around the table at council, Water Care and APL to come up with some consent, it's almost consent conditions, sir, a standard that we could accept.
Okay, no, that's very helpful, and appreciate the frankness of the answer. Depending on what your answer was, I was going to have some more questions, but I think the answers negated the need for those, so I don't have any more, thank you. Is that all all that Waikato Tainui wishes to say to us, Mr. Donald?
Just to, we've worked really closely with Mana Whenua, and I know that they've spoken to you prior in the hearings, and we just want to support the, you know, we've made it clear that we support development, we support homes and jobs for our whānau, but our role as kaitiaki or guardians of the awa is also very important to us, and it's just about balance and being able to find the right solutions to achieve both. So we appreciate the time. Kia ora.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's helpful as well. All right, thank you very much to both of you for your presentation to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Which I think brings us to Auckland Waikato Fish and Game Council, Mr. Clee, who is there and I can see. Welcome, Mr. Clee.
Yes, yes, good afternoon. So my name's David Clee. I'm the Game Bird Manager for Auckland Waikato Fish and Game Council. I'll be touching on primarily some of the issues around predator control today. There is also the other issue which has been substantively resolved, which was touched on by Mr. Lawrence yesterday, just for the record, in regards to the reverse sensitivity relating to hunting in the nearby reserve. So we have come to a resolution there and signed a third-party agreement. So that is no longer a live issue. So just some background for myself. A big part of my job here is to develop, implement and monitor the success or otherwise of predator control projects, and especially that is done in concert with community groups, regional councils, Department of Conservation and so on. I just want to spend a very short amount of time covering the key points of agreement which resulted from the expert conferencing, as I do believe those are quite relevant and important to sort of setting the scene, if you will. So the first point that was acknowledged during that expert conferencing was that Lake Rotokawa is ecologically significant. It ranks second in the Waikato region for biodiversity values and provides habitat for several threatened species, and including some critically endangered ones. So as an example, it contains Australasian bittern. It's estimated that in the 1980s there's only 900 left in the country, and as few as 2,000 left in the world. Since that time, the Waikato population has been severely impacted, especially in some of the previous strongholds. So I guess comparatively, yesterday there's a lot of discussion around mudfish. You know, when you compare that to the number of bittern left in the country, they you know, mudfish could be considered relatively abundant in comparison. The next point that was agreed to during expert conferencing is that there were potential effects of the proposed development, and that those effects could promulgate into the reserve itself. And that effect is the proliferation of cats and dogs that would occur through the increase in residential and urban housing that would be developed in the site. And it was further agreed between all the experts that control of these animals is indeed warranted. So that gives a background, I guess, about the points of agreement. So that gets us into the, I guess, the more the nuts and bolts now about, okay, if those points are agreed and yes, indeed, those issues need to be managed, how do we best manage those particular issues? And I guess that's where we still haven't found a resolution that you know, we can all agree to. So there has been quite a bit of lengthy rebuttal evidence produced by Mr. Croft in particular. So I'm just going to sort of focus on some of those points in relation to my evidence that's before you. So the draft predator control plan, which was presented in the appendices to his rebuttal evidence, and that's Appendix A, and his rebuttal evidence. I did actually provide feedback in writing to Mr. Croft, Mr. Penfold and Mr. Oliver on the draft plan, and that was on the 11th of the 8th. And the key areas that I touched on in that feedback do remain live, and they haven't been addressed in subsequent iterations of the plan. I also offered to have further meetings with the APL team prior to the hearing to try and resolve those issues, but certainly haven't been taken up on that offer.
Sorry, Mr. Lee, just to interrupt, when you say they haven't been resolved, does that mean that there's no changes been made, or that the changes that have been made are insufficient in your view?
The changes that have been made are insufficient in my view, in so much that they haven't covered the areas that I gave feedback on. Okay. And I'll touch on those key points about areas that I think need to be amended in order to achieve those outcomes. So the major point of disagreement relates to the proposed size and scale of the predator control plan. So Appendix C of Appendix A in Mr. Croft's rebuttal evidence, sorry, that's a bit clumsy, outlines the current proposed scale. So the current plan aims to put in 7 cat and stoat stations and 18 possum or rat stations, and it's in a very small portion of the development. It's essentially to the north of the proposed wetland zone. So in my opinion, that size and scale of operation is going to achieve very little, if anything. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, it's part of my job to develop these types of projects. In fact, I was working on a trap line on the weekend. That is to try and safeguard a 4.8 hectare wetland, which again is much smaller than the size and scale of this area and the potential influx of predators into Rotokawa. That has 104 traps, which I consider to be on the thin end of what's required. And yeah, so that is still 5 times or more than 5 times what's being proposed in this particular plan. The other issue that I have is the sort of the overall objective that's both been outlined in the plan itself and in the proposed plan rule, 16.6.3 RD5 1 to 3. So the overarching goal, as is given currently, is to contributing to the restoration and enhancement of Indigenous biodiversity within the site, and therefore indirectly within the adjacent Rotokawa Reserve. So I've got 2 main concerns with that wording. So A, it's assuming that managing predators in a very small part of the APL development will create benefits to the reserve as a whole. And in my opinion, that's quite a leap. And you know, the goal of improving diversity in the development areas is certainly positive. It should be encouraged, but it doesn't substantively address the issues agreed to during expert conferencing, which is the actual and potential adverse effects of species within Rotokawa Reserve with an influx of cats and dogs into that area. So that, in my opinion, should be the objective of any predator control operation, whichever way it ends up being settled. It needs to address the adverse effects that we all agreed were likely to occur during expert conferencing. So in his rebuttal evidence, Mr. Croft appears to have misinterpreted what I was requesting. I'm not requesting, and my evidence does not suggest, that we should have a completed predator control plan at this stage. But I do believe that if predator control is going to be relied upon to address the issues, we need to settle on some minimum performance standards that need to be achieved. So issues such as the size and scale that will lead to effective outcomes and appropriate goals that can be translated through to the plan change wording in order to give us some certainty that predator control will be done properly and achieve outcomes should be instated at this stage. So because we haven't been able to agree to those principles for predator control, in the absence of resolving that issue, I have suggested alternative approaches to managing cats and dogs within the development area. And namely, that preferred option for me would be to put no cat covenants in place, and my evidence touches on how that could be done, and also to put fencing around the edge of the development to preclude the dogs from entering that Rotokawa Reserve. And that's the extent of my evidence today.
Thank you, Mr. Cleave. That's clear. Let's just see if there's any questions. Mr. Mark?
No, nothing from me, Mr. Cleave. Thank you very much for your time.
Mr. Fulton?
Mr. Cleave, yeah, just the, you really what I'm picking up is that you're saying that the agreement with APL needs to be enhanced. The no covenants, one on no cats, I think also being tried in Hamilton in the Peacock area. I'm not too sure whether that proceeded, but I can understand your sentiments, but it's a better agreement is what you're really trying to seek, isn't it, with APL?
Well, at the moment we haven't, I guess there is no agreement at this stage on some of those key points. I guess what we're seeking is better provisions in the plan and the wording in the plan that ensure that there's solid objectives set for what will be, what will occur in future. And as I outlined now, sir, I think that is still lacking at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
I think
And I don't think I have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Clare. I think what you're seeking is clear enough and you've explained it clearly. So I don't have any questions either. So thank you for your evidence. It's been helpful.
Thank you.
I've just had a note to say that Ms. Ma no longer wishes to be heard. So in my understanding, that brings us to the end of the presentations from submitters and further submitters. Is there anybody that is here that disagrees with that and is here on the basis that they're expecting to be speaking to us? I'm going to take silence as agreement. So it's now 12:30. We'll adjourn for lunch and commence after lunch with the presentation from the council. And I think we'll resume at, let's say, 1:15. That gives everyone 45 minutes for lunch, which I think should be sufficient. So we'll adjourn until then. Thank you. Could the panel just hang fire? The new session will be on a separate call. So if you could disconnect from this one and